Inside the game, the protagonist clenched his fist, focusing his ability. The monster in front of him was surreal, a gigantic creature with red eyes. Right after assessing the threat, the protagonist decided to engage in battle. But luck wasn't on his side that day either, and he was eliminated, failing the mission once again. After that, his body hit the ground, nearly losing consciousness, and he could no longer hear any voices. Now in the real world, he was just a supermarket cashier, repeating the same tasks every day. After scanning the items, he would tell the customer the total. In return for his politeness, he received only hostility. Customers would just throw money onto the counter. This was the life of Kim Ki-bon, a 20-year-old university student. He lived each day intensely while working a part-time job. At least that's what they said. He tried to pretend, both to himself and everyone around him. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. There was no way to enjoy such a monotonous life. It was always the same things day after day. He reflected on that while staring at his reflection in the glass. Looking at the door, he thought about the boredom of waiting for customers to walk in. He didn't even hear a thank you. At that moment, something caught his attention. Looking to the side, he noticed the phone. He had received a message from his mother, asking what he was doing. He replied that he was working, as always. She reminded him it was payday. While talking to his mother on the phone, he heard a small explosion. He looked around suspiciously, trying to figure out what had happened. After a few seconds, he ran to the door. He wanted to see what was going on outside after that explosion. Reaching the door, he was shocked by what he saw. He gulped and looked up, sweating. A monster with red eyes, just like the one from the game he used to play, was there. To his horror, it wasn't just one. There were several of them. As he stepped out and positioned himself in the middle of the street, he noticed flying monsters as well. Still in the street, he thought he must be dreaming. This couldn't be real. While thinking that, he heard a growl behind him. He turned his head and saw a huge monster with multiple rows of teeth. His expression was one of total shock. He thought he needed to run immediately, so he started running. He ran as fast as he could, his mind in panic. While running, he questioned where those monsters had come from. He could no longer stay on his feet and ended up falling, hitting his arms on the ground. After falling, he looked back to see if he was still being chased. He had stumbled, and upon looking, he saw something that shocked him. There was a body on the ground right behind him. He noticed those legs looked a lot like his. Right after that, he started coughing, feeling pain. Then he fell again, face down on the ground, unable to get up. All he could do was look, and he noticed something coming his way. It was the monster with multiple rows of teeth, growling at him. He didn't know what that monster was trying to do there. Still lying on the ground, he couldn't do anything, only watch. After this event, a system window appeared with a notification. It was about the human awakening. The program had been activated, and this was just a test being initiated. Meanwhile, the protagonist was still lying on the ground, barely conscious. He wondered what was happening, but remained fallen, with his torso one way and his legs the other. In a flash, his body was reconstructed and thrown far away. He put his hand on his head, a bit dazed, not understanding what had happened. He looked around. The place was strange, and he had no idea where he was. Looking down, he noticed various codes, as if they were algorithms. He also realized his legs had reattached to his body. While all of this was happening, his mind remained blank. A voice startled the player so much that it made him get up, welcoming him to the awakening area. With that, the protagonist realized it was the same voice as before. He felt small among the crowd of symbols, as if he were inside a computer. Once again, he was informed that the awakening test was being initiated. He was also notified that a new monster was being generated. The notification stated that the monster would be automatically erased after landing a hit, whether it caused damage or not. Facing the enormous monster, the tiny protagonist wondered how he could possibly attack it. Meanwhile, the red-eyed monster just observed and growled. The monster was about to attack again, and all the protagonist could do was try to dodge and scream. At one point, he covered his face with his hands, trying not to see what might be his end. With the attack, a cloud of dust rose, blocking all visibility. The message appeared again, informing him that he had failed once more to awaken. Little by little, the protagonist's body began to regenerate. When he looked to the side, he saw the mark of his previous body still on the ground. Some details of that scene left him shocked. His widened eyes showed how dangerous that monster was. He was shaken upon realizing that what lay on the ground was his own body. His stomach turned, and he couldn't hold back the nausea. After being regenerated, a difficult thought invaded his mind. However, he was interrupted as the monster had reactivated. Now, with tears in his eyes, he looked up again. Still not knowing what to do, he merely bared his teeth at the monster. In a few seconds, the monster growled at him and charged. Once again, he was destroyed, his body separated from his head. That scene was no longer anything new. Even so, he could still feel his body and was able to cry and scream. He also heard the notification saying he had failed. His body was regenerated once more, and the notification informed him that the monster's attack would occur soon. This time, the protagonist was furious, screaming as if someone could hear him. He asked what they expected him to do against that monster, but then he was notified. They said it was impossible to defeat it, and that it had always been that way since the beginning. The protagonist was startled to realize that the voice was answering his questions. Gripped by courage, he asked who that voice was and why he had been brought there. Only 3 words were spoken to the protagonist: player, awakening, and justice. Then they said that the human species had the potential to awaken. Upon hearing those words, the protagonist realized he was being treated as just a character. In front of him, he could see all his previous bodies, some scattered around. He reacted by gritting his teeth, sweat dripping. He was a player, and that was all they told him. Once again, he stood before that enormous monster. As the monster approached, he knew he had never had a chance from the start. Once more, the monster launched its attack against the protagonist. This time, he responded differently. He could keep dying in agony or accept the situation as it was. That's why, after dodging, driven by an unknown instinct, he gathered a power he hadn't known he possessed. The message arrived announcing that the awakening was complete, and he had acquired a technique and an ability. After checking his status, he clenched his fist, consumed by hatred. He prepared to attack, propelling his feet with force. Using a body-strengthening ability, he charged at the monster. He thought there was only one thing to do, so he clenched his fists and struck. He was going all in. His life depended on it, and he had already accepted his condition. He was determined to end that damn test once and for all. That's why he punched the monster several times, until he managed to throw it far away, causing enough damage and completing the awakening. A new message appeared, congratulating him on the awakening. The protagonist, now filled with anger and a mix of relief, felt different for having completed the mission. Now he seemed to see everything from a different perspective. Even so, there were things he still didn't understand. He remained surprised, hoping something else would happen. As time passed, he still didn't return to his reality. He began to scream, trying to understand what was happening. He wanted them to stop wasting his time and send him back to his reality. However, the notification indicated an unknown error. He could no longer leave that test area. The news caught him off guard, and his eyes showed utter despair. Once again, the notification announced the start of the awakening test. He couldn't believe that the monster was standing before him again. The monster appeared as usual, attacking immediately. This time, the protagonist did nothing. He was struck by the monster's paw and then regenerated. Now he was upset as he realized he was stuck in an endless loop. He addressed the system, believing they must be joking with him. Once again, he was struck by that monster and, as always, would be regenerated. The protagonist had become just a character in the game, affected by a bug. After a long time, the cycle of death and resurrection continued. A week passed, then a month, then even a year. His sanity slowly began to deteriorate. Even though the body was regenerated, the mind was no longer intact. At a certain point, he was notified that his life points had increased and that the damage was being adjusted. He could see in his status that his strength was at 25, his agility at 11, and his magic power at 22. He found it strange that the stats were increasing, since all he ever did was be constantly attacked. He was informed that due to the continuous attacks, the body accumulated resistance, causing the life points to rise. He didn't care about the stats, but he felt satisfied believing that the error had been corrected. His expectations, however, were cut short when he discovered he could never leave that place. Once again, he found himself in a difficult situation, standing still and sweating nervously. He was struck by the monster again, and little by little, his body began to regenerate once more. And so years passed. The protagonist tried to escape with all his might. He tried to resist the test monster. At one point, his strength had reached 56, his agility 24, and his magical power 37. Even so, he kept being defeated day after day. He felt that all that time spent there had been meaningless, as if he no longer cared. The test monster was a transcendent being according to the program, and defeating it was impossible. After 10 years inside that system, he finally asked something he had wanted to know for a long time. He wondered about what was happening outside on Earth. The system informed him that almost nothing had changed. Time in that dimension was 300 times faster. So 300 days there equaled just 12 days in the real world. This made the protagonist reflect. Even so, he didn't want to lose even 12 days of his life and routine. He was desperate. He needed to buy the fried chicken he had promised his mother. And, as always happened whenever he stood still, he was trampled by that monster. Once again regenerated, 500 years had passed since he arrived in that place. He felt that all his memories were dormant. His family and even his friends seemed like shadows he could no longer clearly see. All he could think about was a single question. It was always why. And once again, that monster roared in his ear while he remained seated. As the monster attacked, he kept asking himself why all of that was happening. But this time, the monster didn't manage to hit him. He was so enraged that he struck the monster before it could hit him. And this time, he was the one who chose to be aggressive toward the monster. He was showing his teeth again, but now not out of sorrow, out of anger. He unleashed all the rage he had built up, and all his questions onto the monster. He no longer cared about awakening or difficulty. He didn't care about anything anymore. He just wanted answers to his whys. All he wanted was to live this thrilling life to the fullest. Now he was so filled with hatred toward the monster that he felt like he would explode inside. Even with its back turned, the monster continued roaring. The protagonist slowly turned his body toward the monster, and he roared back at it, showing his teeth and a menacing gaze. With all that fury, he launched himself at the monster. And so, 10 years passed since the day of humanity's awakening, and the city seemed unchanged. However, a crack appeared in the sky and electricity began to surge. That crack opened a black hole. The system still showed an error, and the protagonist emerged from that dimensional rift. He had defeated the monster, leaving only its carcass on the ground. Now the protagonist was covered in electricity, floating among the clouds. He no longer looked the same after having spent 300 years inside that test. He was now at max level. The system was struggling to start in online mode, being forced to temporarily run in offline mode. Over the last 300 years, the young man had thought about one thing every single day. He dreamed of the moment he'd eat fried chicken next to his mother, and of the sweet messages she used to send him. As soon as he had the chance, he asked the system where his mother was. However, he got no answer. The location function wasn't available in offline mode. Given that, he decided to go to the neighborhood where he had lived before being trapped in that endless test. But when he arrived, he was deeply shocked. Everything that once stood there had turned into ruins and debris. He couldn't understand why his old house was no longer standing. While trying to process that reality, 2 guards appeared behind him. Realizing he was a civilian, one of the guards called out to the young man. He slowly turned around, not understanding why a soldier was telling him that area was off limits. He wanted to know what had happened to the neighborhood where he grew up. He wanted to understand why everything was destroyed and in incomplete ruins. The guards exchanged confused glances, not knowing who that young man was. One of them even asked if he'd spent the past few years isolated on a mountain. Then they explained that the destruction was the result of a dungeon break that occurred 10 years ago. As soon as he heard that, the young man instantly understood it was about the monster invasion. With a trembling voice, he asked where the people who used to live there were. One of the soldiers answered firmly that all of them had died. The protagonist's eyes widened, unable to believe that news. Immediately after, he clenched his teeth tightly, trembling and mumbling nearly inaudible words. Noticing the young man's desperation, the soldier stepped back and clarified that there was an exception. He stated that some people had survived because they weren't in the area at the time of the attack. According to him, those people were under government protection in a safe zone. Overcome by sudden anxiety, the protagonist grabbed the soldier's collar, demanding more information. With wide eyes, he begged for an answer about his mother's whereabouts. As soon as the soldier said that the safe zone where the survivors were sheltered was in Moontown, in Zone B, the protagonist immediately let go of him. In the next instant, he dashed toward the mentioned location. The soldier breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that the encounter with that young man had been more dangerous than he expected. Before he could compose himself, the radio broadcasted an urgent alert. A dungeon break was about to occur. The situation was so critical that the message was repeated several times over the communicator. The estimated location was exactly in the refugee zone, the same place the protagonist was headed. Immediately, visuals showed that sector. Lightning sliced through the sky like a warning of an impending calamity. Several military vehicles rushed to the area, accompanied by armed troops. The emergency was so great that even the presence of a lieutenant colonel became necessary. The officer demanded reinforcements as the dungeon break seemed inevitable. Outraged, he questioned the absence of the guild forces and the reason for their delay. With clenched fists, he cursed loudly, convinced they were neglecting the refugees. He assumed the delay was due to the guild demanding more funds. Meanwhile, a young first lieutenant asked the colonel what their next steps would be. He ordered everyone to form a defensive line and prioritize eliminating the smaller monsters. At first, she seemed hesitant about the decision. She thought it was too risky to confront the invasion directly, as all the support services could be hit. The colonel, however, was harsh with her, telling her to shut up and follow the order. So as the sunset stained the sky red, the soldiers began to form the front line. Amidst the chaos, the protagonist finally arrived at the location searching for his mother. He found the concentration of soldiers and military vehicles suspicious. He decided to ask the system what was going on. He was informed that a 5-star dungeon break was about to occur in Zone B. In just 3 minutes, a new dungeon would be generated, and the same monsters from before would return. The young man's heart tightened. His mother was in danger. Without hesitation, he began walking among the army vehicles. He was soon stopped by a soldier who warned him of the imminent event. Shouting sternly, the soldier ordered the young man to fall back to the safe zone. However, the young man completely ignored the order and kept going. His presence was so imposing that, upon touching him, two soldiers recoiled in fear and were thrown to the ground. Watching from a distance, the fallen guards couldn't understand who that person was. From headquarters, the colonel shouted, demanding to know who had let a civilian cross the perimeter. The first lieutenant, equally stunned, didn't know how to respond. Now the protagonist was surrounded by dozens of soldiers with weapons pointed at him. Even so, his expression remained unchanged, showing no sign of fear. He stood still at the center of the formation, unshaken. When he realized they didn't intend to move, he firmly asked them to step aside. The intensity of his aura made everyone hesitate. None of the soldiers could explain why they were obeying that command. The first lieutenant, seeing her companions step back, angrily asked why they had allowed it. One of the soldiers replied in a low, nervous voice, "That man was a player." Upon hearing that, the lieutenant widened her eyes and began to sweat. All eyes turned to the young man, now with fear and respect. Meanwhile, the sky gave even clearer signs that the rupture was near. The seal was finally broken, and the guards looked up in disbelief. One of them noticed that the sky looked like it was being torn open by giant claws. In a state of shock, he could only scream. The dungeon break came to pass, and a horrendous creature emerged, roaring as it exited the rift. The soldiers panicked, realizing how unprepared they were. They desperately searched for the guild reinforcements. The first lieutenant, having no answers, just clenched her teeth and ran off to find a solution. The soldiers shouted for her to come back, but she didn't stop. She rushed toward the monsters, determined. Meanwhile, in another area, the protagonist continued searching for his mother. Despite the system warning that the dungeon was classified as 5 stars, he climbed the stairs calmly. He believed those creatures no longer posed a threat. As he thought this, a large monster with a lizard-like appearance watched him. He was not alone, for others around him growled and bellowed loudly. One of them lunged, trying to devour him. But as it got close, it was violently repelled by an invisible force. It was as if there were a barrier around the young man. More monsters tried to attack him, but the protagonist didn't even turn around. He knew he was capable of defeating all of them with ease. At one point, he dodged an attack and firmly grabbed one of the monsters. He warned in a threatening voice not to stop him from moving forward. After swinging the enemy through the air, he hurled it against the wall, ending its existence with a powerful stomp. Other monsters watched in terror at how quickly he was wiping out their companions. Out of patience, the young man advanced, determined to finish them all at once. He leaped into the air, striking some and repelling others who tried to react. With fast and precise blows, he eliminated them one by one. Even with new enemies appearing, he remained merciless. For every monster that came, there was a fatal strike. In no time, only bodies remained, falling amid the destruction. While preparing to eliminate anyone else who dared to stand in his way, the first lieutenant was running toward him, climbing the same stairs he had passed through. Looking up, she saw that he had defeated all the monsters of the 5-star dungeon by himself. She stood in awe as she witnessed that scene. The protagonist had single-handedly stopped the complete collapse of the dungeon. While the lieutenant stood still, watching that mysterious young man, more monsters rapidly approached. One of them was so massive that upon seeing the scene, it simply stopped in front of them and began to back away. However, upon realizing the other monsters had been eliminated by that boy, the giant hesitated. The creature's eyes filled with fear as it understood that the young man had defeated all the others. Now it simply watched him, and the protagonist was certain that this was the dungeon boss. He had been informed that the dungeon break would be neutralized once the boss was defeated. For that reason, the protagonist calmly walked toward the monstrous creature. He only bared his teeth in a confident gesture as he stared at the being. The monster needed to show its ferocity, and thus bared all of its terrifying teeth. Not even this intimidating attempt shook the young protagonist's confidence. The lieutenant, upon witnessing such a scene, was completely horrified, but didn't have time to truly panic. As she quickly turned around, she noticed the presence of some civilians nearby. They were some of the survivors, and now she needed to act immediately to save them. She knew she only had a short window of time to evacuate everyone from the area safely. Urgently, she asked the civilians to run as fast as they could. However, the civilians seemed confused and unsure of what to do. Exchanging desperate glances, they remained paralyzed before the sinister growls that the monster kept emitting. Everyone was completely terrified, unable to take a single step to escape. When they finally managed to react, they ran in tears, screaming desperately for their lives. As everyone ran past the protagonist, he remained standing in the same place. He saw men, women, and children screaming for help, begging to be saved from that nightmare. Until, in the midst of the crowd, someone stumbled and fell. A child had dropped her toy far from her body. The mother, upon noticing her daughter's fall, turned around in desperation and begged her to get up quickly. Driven by desperation, the mother ran back toward her daughter lying on the ground. The screams ended up catching the attention of another monster nearby that was watching them. With that, the creature charged at high speed to attack the defenseless mother and daughter. The woman, with nothing else to do, simply hugged her daughter and closed her eyes, bracing for the tragic end. But at that moment, the monster was eliminated and both were saved from the deadly attack. The child was still crying but slowly opened her eyes to understand what was happening. The protagonist had already handled the situation, dragging the monster's body away from the frightened people. Everyone was extremely grateful that he had saved the woman and her daughter in that critical moment. However, the young man only cast a brief glance backward and saw those people fleeing. Then he asked the system to locate his mother, who had been missing for centuries among them. The system received the order and began scanning the area, using the player's memories as reference. The scan process would be completed in 3 seconds, and the countdown was nearing its end. After the scan finished, the result was negative. His mother had not been found. This plunged the protagonist into deep sadness, as his hopes dwindled more with each passing moment. After 300 years away from his father, his mother, and his sister, he could no longer recall their faces. Even so, during all that time, he thought about them every day to avoid forgetting them completely. Currently, however, his memories were faint, and he could barely picture the faces of his family. There was no time for sorrow, as the monster before him still roared with relentless fury. The creature screamed as if it wanted to begin a battle with the young warrior immediately. The lieutenant, who was still nearby, covered her ears tightly to block out the agonizing sound. She realized the monster was about to attack, which demanded an immediate response. Inside the creature's enormous mouth, several bright stars quickly began to form. Those orbs would serve as projectiles, and the monster launched them all toward the protagonist. Even while standing still, the young man knew exactly what was happening and activated his special ability. It was a body enhancement, and with it, his hair turned white once again. After a successful activation, Awakened Mode was triggered, and his power increased exponentially. Now the protagonist possessed colossal strength, ready to finish off that opponent. Without hesitation, he attacked the creature, remembering his mother's words, which intensified his rage. He launched himself furiously at the monster, while memories of his previous life flooded his mind. In that enhanced form, his eyes and hair glowed in pure white, as if made of light. He no longer feared any attack, for he had faced battles like this more than 3,000 times. He struck and dodged attacks effortlessly, as if performing something routine. Meanwhile, the lieutenant, lying on the ground, watched it all from below in awe. She realized that the young man was redirecting the boss monster's attacks away from the city, protecting everyone. After accomplishing this and landing on the ground, she continued to stare at him in astonishment. Her face bore a mixture of surprise and admiration for everything she had just witnessed. She noticed that during the fight, the protagonist hadn't missed a single strike. However, the monster in front of them began to concentrate its energy to unleash a devastating attack. It opened its mouth, revealing enormous teeth, and channeled a dense, radiant energy. It was preparing to fire a colossal energy ball, which it released with fury as it opened its jaws. The enormous sphere was launched directly at the protagonist, who still remained motionless. His hand began to emit intense electricity, and with that, he prepared his counterattack. Overtaken by a silent rage, he channeled all his power into a single devastating punch. Clenching his fists and striking, he completely deflected the creature's attack. The movement opened a gap in the monster's own assault, creating a sudden imbalance. Even the monster, upon seeing the young man neutralize its attack, couldn't comprehend what was happening. Soon after, the creature let out a deafening scream and vanished into the air like cosmic dust. Some time later, civilians and soldiers looked up at the sky, realizing that the dungeon had been cleared. All that remained there was the protagonist, surrounded by electricity and the destruction caused by his strength. The young lieutenant, still sitting on the ground, gazed at the outcome of the battle without being able to react. Even though she had witnessed everything with her own eyes, she could hardly believe what she had seen. After neutralizing the monster, the protagonist deactivated his ability, and the electricity dissipated. Gradually, his hair returned to its original black color, just as it was before the transformation. He remained in the same spot, observing the chaos around him, though his mind was far from there. He wondered how he could find his mother in a world that felt increasingly unfamiliar. He was exhausted from everything. He had spent many years fighting monsters, dreaming of home, and when he finally arrived, he didn't find what he had longed so much to see. Meanwhile, near the lieutenant, an elderly woman was climbing the stairs and stopped, staring at the young man from afar. Upon seeing that figure, the woman began to tremble, still watching him intently. When she spoke the protagonist's name, he simply froze for a few moments. Slowly, he turned, and as he did, his eyes filled with a hope he had nearly forgotten. A voice scan began, and the woman's voice matched the one recorded in the player's memory. Images of his mother returned to his mind, like flashes stored for 3,000 years. He felt the emotions that had faded over time come crashing back with overwhelming force. They burst forth suddenly, like a broken dam, overflowing from within him. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at his mother, who was also crying upon reuniting with her son. Both slowly moved their feet, finally managing to approach each other. Now that their bodies had overcome the shock, the woman tossed the posters she was holding into the air. They were missing person posters with the protagonist's photo prominently displayed. At last, the two were together, embracing and crying as if time itself had stopped. The woman told her son she had searched for him for many years without ever giving up. All the protagonist could manage to say was that he hadn't been able to bring the chicken he had promised. While they remained in an embrace, a new monster appeared and launched a surprise attack from behind. It struck the woman, who fell wounded right in front of the hero's eyes. He could hardly believe that his mother had been attacked at such a long-awaited moment. The protagonist believed that, after 3,000 years of being defeated daily by those masters, he had become stronger. After so much suffering, he possessed an extremely powerful body, yet even so, he couldn't protect the one he loved most. While holding his mother in his arms, he was caught off guard by one of those monsters, whose claw pierced through her body mercilessly. When the monster pulled its claws back, the woman simply dropped to her knees, powerless. The protagonist, consumed by despair, screamed his mother's name as she lay on the cold ground. The monster, meanwhile, just stared at the boy, who was crying and begging for his mother's life. Without giving him time to react, the creature launched its claws toward the young man with murderous intent. However, someone had been watching the scene and would not allow it to happen again. It was the attendant Lee Jiun, who drew her weapon with impressive speed and began firing at the monster. With her flawless precision and honed skill, she prevented the attack and saved the young man from being struck. Meanwhile, the hero continued holding his mother, pleading for her to wake up from that nightmare. The woman, still barely conscious, gently touched her son's face. He looked into her eyes with an expression of pain and hope. With a weak smile and her face covered in sweat, the woman asked him not to cry and told him how much she loved him. Right after, she lost consciousness, leaving her son in despair in his arms. The hero, overcome with tears and anguish, broke down in a fit of screams and sobs. With his face turned toward the sky, he cried out with all his strength, releasing the pain that consumed his chest in that moment. He remained there, motionless, still holding his lifeless mother in his arms. Much later, at the 39th Battalion of the Defense Force, the colonel was complaining about how excessively noisy the days had been. He also expressed curiosity, asking about the protagonist and what he had been up to over the last month. Lieutenant Lee Jiun reported that he had been clearing dungeons and making rapid progress. She also mentioned that discontent among the guilds was growing quickly, becoming a serious problem. The colonel then placed his hand into his uniform pocket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to the lieutenant, informing her that those were direct orders she was to follow. The mission was clear: find the protagonist and bring him back before he caused even greater problems. Meanwhile, the hero continued destroying every monster that appeared before him, without hesitation. He used the strength and skill he had acquired during the 3,000 years he'd been imprisoned. With grit and sharp instincts, he executed flawless movements that secured one victory after another against his enemies. The hero's power and the destruction he caused could be seen from afar as a sign of his fury. The monsters were annihilated one by one, without any chance to fight back. When the dust settled, the protagonist stood revealed, holding a defeated monster in his hand. Just ahead, dozens more monsters appeared, roaring with fury, lined up and hungry for combat. Even in large numbers and attempting simultaneous attacks, they could not escape the inevitable end. With his blade in hand, the protagonist activated his special body enhancement ability. The transformation began, and he entered awakened mode, stage 1, with his eyes and hair turning completely white. With that, his strength and agility increased in a visibly terrifying way. Endowed with immense power, he managed to wipe out dozens of monsters in a single series of blows. That battle was decisive and resulted in the complete eradication of the dungeon's monsters. The dungeon at last was left clean, silent, and free of any threat. After so much effort, the hero returned to normal and sat under the rain, still feeling the pain of loss. As he remained there, unmoving, someone approached and held an umbrella over his head. He raised his gaze and saw who was holding the umbrella under the pouring rain. It was once again Lieutenant Lee, now standing beside the hero, this time more formally. She introduced herself as if it were the first time, although they already knew each other. She explained that on the previous occasion, she hadn't thought it appropriate to reveal her identity. As she spoke, he simply listened to her voice and the sound of raindrops hitting the umbrella. She looked at him with sadness in her eyes, saying she understood the pain he carried. She knew he was destroying all the monsters and clearing every dungeon. But she also realized it didn't make sense, because he was only releasing all the rage he had bottled up. He remained silent for a moment, absorbing the words he had just heard. In the next instant, he questioned whether he should really just stand still in the face of everything. He recalled the 3,000 years during which his bones were broken and his flesh disintegrated every day. Only after that eternity of torment was he able to return, even when his body had turned to dust. He came back from that hell only to reunite with his family and reclaim his life. However, all the sacrifice now seemed to have been in vain, and he spoke these words while standing facing the lieutenant. She, surprised by his words, widened her eyes and tried to understand his pain. With seriousness, he asked whether he was supposed to just endure everything in silence and accept it quietly. After that question, the two remained silent, standing still under the persistent rain. With nothing more to say, he walked past her and moved forward, leaving her behind. She remained still, holding the umbrella without shielding herself from the rain streaming down her face. Lowering her head for a moment, she seemed to be thinking about something important. She suddenly turned and shouted to the back of the young man, walking away with determination. She firmly said that she would help him, that she would be by his side in his quest for revenge. She promised she would fight alongside him to wipe out all dungeons and all monsters. She assured him that he wouldn't have to face everything alone anymore. He just needed to go with her. 6 months passed after that conversation, and in a large hospital, the hero's mother remained hospitalized. Still unconscious, she breathed with the help of machines and intensive medical care. He observed that true miracle from behind a glass, feeling relief that she was alive. Even weakened, she was like a rare gem in the eyes of her son. He gave a faint smile and spoke to her through the glass as if she could hear him. He shared the latest news, saying that he was now a government employee and had been promoted. He explained that because of that, he might not be able to visit her as often. He asked her not to be sad, since people working for the government were always busy. Placing his hand against the glass, he promised he'd return soon to see her again. Slowly, he stepped away from the glass and walked toward the hospital elevator. Once inside the elevator, his expression changed dramatically. As soon as the doors opened, he was greeted by several officers lined up. The hero walked past the row of officers, removing the tie he had worn especially to visit his mother. As he walked among them, his outfit gradually began to transform. With each step, his appearance changed, revealing another side of himself. His hair and eyes turned white, marking the activation of his combat state. With resolve, he commanded everyone present to follow him immediately. The scene then shifted to a location infested with various threatening monster species. From below, the hero looked up at the top of the dungeon with a gaze full of pure hatred. He was determined to exterminate every single monster in that place without mercy. Although some appeared strong and extremely stubborn, to him they were nothing but obstacles. They were just abominations that needed to be eradicated from the face of the earth. Around him, a current of electricity pulsed, indicating that the battle was about to begin. In another location, it was announced that the defense service for the metropolitan area, provided by the Shield Guild, had ended. A man in a bar heard this news on the TV. While stirring his drink to make it colder, he took a generous sip. Placing the glass back on the table, he seemed to be preparing to speak to the man beside him. He began by asking what business the man had there. The man replied that he was there to drink the same thing as the captain, the patrol squad leader. The man went quiet for a moment and then removed the hat from his head. He asked the white-haired man with a sharp gaze to get straight to the point. The white-haired man expressed his admiration for the captain and asked if he was aware of recent events. He was referring to the reason behind the recent turmoil, pointing to someone who was disrupting the guild's peace. Meanwhile, the news report continued, stating that everything was related to the recent collapse of several dungeons. The man in the blue suit with white hair said that person was truly a massive headache. Meanwhile, the guild captain believed that the man should be eliminated as soon as possible. The man in the blue suit felt the captain didn't need to speak so menacingly every time he saw something. As he said this, he placed a document containing information on the counter. He explained that they had received orders from the chief to recruit that person. Now the hero was to be treated as a team captain. The patrol squad leader didn't seem pleased with the idea. He simply tucked the information into his coat and left, saying he understood. When asked if he wasn't going to finish his drink, he, already at the door, said he was done. The man in the blue suit watched the captain walk away, while his glass still had drink left in it. The scene shifts to a 5-star dungeon, a nest of monstrous birds. Thunder and lightning revealed that the dungeon was being entered by the hero's team. In a short time, he and his group passed through the rift. The hero led a team of 4 others. The system announced that they had entered a dungeon, and it was a nest of monstrous birds. He, along with his team, all in matching gear, simply observed. Then one of them called out to Captain Kim, stating that this was the last dungeon scheduled for the month. Turning around, he asked everyone to stay there and wait for his return. With that, he leaped forward, leaving his team behind on the cliff. He advanced, launching himself against the monsters. And even though they were hostile, it didn't intimidate the protagonist. He asked the system where the monster boss was located. Immediately, the system began scanning to locate the boss. While that was happening, he started taking out the lesser enemies. He began with powerful punches, swiftly paralyzing several of them. He kept going, gaining momentum until the scan was complete. He took down every monster in his path and had 5 seconds to do so. So he wasted no time and attacked as many monsters as possible. When the estimated time ran out, he was surrounded by several of them. And when he was informed that the boss's location was to the southeast, 12 kilometers away, the hero simply blasted all the monsters around him by activating his superpower. That was his body enhancement ability, which kept him surrounded by electricity. In that form, his eyes and hair turned white. He scanned the path he needed to follow and launched himself like lightning. His face showed determination. Changing his route when needed, he continued forward, until he reached the place where the monster boss was. When he did, he stopped and began observing the monster, which was truly massive. It had also already spotted the hero. It was the boss of the monstrous bird albatrosses. Despite its intimidating presence, Captain Kim only stared at it, showing his hatred for the monster. From afar, his team watched everything happening to their captain through binoculars. A team member with long hair and a mask asked what the situation was like. The one observing replied that it would probably be over in a few moments. They all thought the captain was amazing. He was fighting the albatross and hundreds of monstrous birds alone. With that, the long-haired man, the vice captain, ordered the others to quickly collect the spirit stones. The order was to leave nothing behind, and while they were gathering the stones, they noticed that the veil separating the monsters from that reality was tearing open again. They found it strange that the dungeon entrance was opening, but from it emerged a dagger. That act caught the vice captain by surprise. He wasn't off guard and managed to dodge, receiving only a light scratch on his face. After that, a person fully emerged and tried to eliminate the vice captain. When the person exited the dungeon entrance, they grabbed the vice captain from behind and stabbed him. After that, the vice captain was shown lying on the ground while the opponent's sword was stained. With that man on the ground, the veil tore open and others came through as well. All of them were armed, and the rest of the hero's team didn't understand what was happening. They spoke among themselves while Kim Ki-bong's team watched with wide eyes. The man said that if that person had been eliminated with just one attack, he wasn't much. He concluded that it probably wasn't Kim Ki-bong. That man speaking was Beck, the leader of the patrol squad. The team realized they were searching for their captain. The squad leader asked who Kim Ki-bong was. Meanwhile, their captain and leader was locked in battle with the monster, which was about to be taken down by the hero's hands. After striking, the monster began writhing and showing signs of defeat. However, the monster wouldn't go down easily. It managed to charge up a power that emerged from its mouth. The hero simply watched as the power slowly reached its mark. The monster's strike was strong enough to set a large part of that area ablaze. Back at the location of the captain's team, who were still being interrogated by the enemies, Baek Cheol felt the tremor from the monster's attack and realized the explosion had been massive. However, he dismissed that small explosion, deciding he needed to take drastic action to get what he wanted. Walking toward those people, he said that what was about to happen couldn't be avoided. Looking directly at them, he warned that he would eliminate everyone until their leader revealed himself. Meanwhile, a completely dark forest was shown, and voices were coming from within it. Someone at the top was giving orders to those inside the forest, commanding them to find the protagonist. That person was another young man with white hair who, from the top, was waiting to find Kim Ki-bong. Meanwhile, what had actually happened when the hero attacked the monster was the following. Striking with great impact, the monster coughed but didn't stay still. Immediately, it launched a powerful counterattack. Everything became clear when the fire attack was directed at the hero. At that moment, everything was engulfed in flames, and that was when his innate trait was triggered. With it, he activated the resistance attribute, ranked S. His status was updated, now with an additional resistance attribute. The monster was shocked to see that after the flash of the attack, the hero was completely unharmed. The surprise was so great that its eyes widened. Now the protagonist stood there, with white hair and white eyes, staring down the monster. He said he would end it all quickly, clenching his fists. He prepared to attack, and acting swiftly, began to strike back. He launched himself like a star toward the monster, hitting it with a precise attack. That strike split the monster in two. The parts fell to the ground, and a notification appeared for the hero. The monster boss had been defeated. He also noticed that the monster seemed to have dropped something. Curious, he crouched down and picked up the black sphere. He didn't know what the monster boss had dropped. He had never seen that object before, so he asked the system what it was. The system performed an analysis. After the analysis, it revealed that it was a day stone. He wanted to know what he could do with that sphere. However, the system identified that due to offline mode, more information couldn't be accessed. It was also at that moment that several warning messages began arriving for the protagonist. He was alerted that a battle had started at the entrance of that dungeon. It was shown that the fight was unfolding in the direction where the patrol squad leader was defeating the protagonist's team one by one, without giving them much of a chance to fight back. Even with their weapons and experience, they were no match for the squad leader. Thus, he overpowered them all, taking them down with his attacks and skill. With little effort, he managed to neutralize everyone on the protagonist's team, who now lay on the ground. Upon seeing that scene, he figured that none of them could be the person he was looking for. He concluded that Kim Ki-bong wasn't among them. That's when they heard something that caught their attention on the horizon. One of Bak's subordinates reported that someone had eliminated the monster and cleared the dungeon. In fact, it was just as Bak had thought. The earlier explosion had been Kim Ki-bong fighting. Now the squad leader wanted everyone to find a way to descend that cliff. However, descending became unnecessary, because as soon as they turned around, they noticed someone had appeared behind him. The leader turned to see who had arrived at the location, but the dust made it hard to see clearly. Even so, a silhouette was visible to the subordinates, who immediately recognized the captain. The subordinate widened his still unbruised eyes and felt relieved to see the captain. He looked in his direction stunned, while his subordinate felt satisfaction. The hero simply remained standing and then walked toward the squad leader. Bake stayed where he was, watching that man approach him. He said he'd been looking for him and introduced himself as the squad leader. However, as the hero drew closer to the man, he felt a terrifying pressure, like something was squeezing his brain. That man's strength was unimaginable. Bake realized, just by being close to Kim Kibon, that his presence was more terrifying than many of the monsters he had fought. It felt so real it was as if his life was being threatened. In fact, what was happening was simply that the protagonist was just a few steps away from the man, who wore a frightened expression and was sweating, simply because he was standing near such an impressive presence. Bake, even as captain and leader of the patrol squad, was still trembling. Things got worse when that powerful voice addressed the Shield Guild member. The protagonist wanted to make sure that the man belonged to the Shield Guild, so he asked. Meanwhile, one of the leader's subordinates asked who the protagonist thought he was to speak like that. Bake, seeing the disrespect, ordered him to be quiet. The man fell silent at his commander's request. Despite his serious expression, the leader of that squad knew that even if they all fought against that man, they couldn't win. Besides, he had been ordered to recruit that person. Now Bake thought it was all just a joke. The captain rank was far too low for someone like the protagonist. He thought they would need to make him an ally, even if it cost them an executive position. He tried to negotiate with the protagonist, saying he had heard correctly, and that they were from the Shield Guild. He said the guild would grant him any wish he had. With that, the subordinates of that captain began to worry, because they knew the guild could actually fulfill that promise. Besides, the salary of a captain in a major guild was enormous. Joining a big guild was a chance to completely change one's life. The members of that guild watched, thinking that every player longed for recognition. While that man spoke, the protagonist just watched, until he finally spoke, saying he had a question. That made the squad leader relax a bit, thinking the protagonist had shown some interest. The protagonist's question was whether the Shield Guild was in charge of protecting the capital. As he asked, memories of the accident involving his mother resurfaced, so he also asked if the Shield Guild was responsible for protecting the immigrant sector of Zone B. The man agreed, saying that indeed, not only that area, but a large part of the metropolis was under their jurisdiction. Before he could finish the sentence, he was struck with a heavy blow to the face. The impact was so intense it sent the captain flying back to his subordinates. He collapsed immediately, half unconscious. Meanwhile, his subordinates asked what the man thought he was doing. The protagonist, with a serious expression, explained that if they hadn't figured it out yet, he would simplify. He was seeking revenge for having touched his squad. He made it clear that it had nothing to do with personal feelings. To better understand the story, the largest guild was the Shield Guild. It was the one responsible for protecting the capital area where the high-level dungeons clustered. It was a large guild with over 5,000 members, including 3 S-rank players. But even so, they couldn't convince the protagonist to join their guild. Despite all those skilled soldiers, they were not enough to stop a single person. Everyone gave their best to try to restrain Kim Kibon, who defeated them with ease. The protagonist sought revenge, and the monsters weren't the only ones to blame. The guild's negligence caused him to lose the chance to live alongside his loved one. Now what could be seen was that group from the guild being flung through the air. The captain watched, unable to believe what he was seeing, because he had brought with him the best members of the elite. He thought that if it came to a fight, they would be able to hold that person back, but now they were being treated like toys in the hands of that monster. He was wiping the floor with them as if they were old, dirty rags. On top of that, he didn't seem to care one bit about which guild they belonged to. Sometime later, at the Shield Guild's headquarters, the wounded were taken for treatment. The director, watching everything, couldn't understand why there were so many injured, since the intention was to recruit peacefully. Now the director stood, smoking his cigar, talking to the nurses. He wanted to speak with the captain, but Bake was still unconscious. Even so, the director insisted on being alone with the captain, as he needed to know what had happened. When they were alone, the director saw that the captain was covered in bruises. He pulled a syringe from his pocket because he needed answers. He then injected the substance into the captain's abdomen and pressed the device. Within seconds, the captain began to move his fingers. Shortly after, his body responded to the medication. It was as if the captain had instantly regained consciousness. He was still recovering and coughing. The director told him he looked terrible and asked what had happened. The man, looking down, tried to come up with an excuse for everything that had happened. Meanwhile, the director sat down in a chair. Then he asked for an explanation, and he wanted it in detail. "Can I bow my head and think for a moment?" said the captain. "How did the entire escort team get defeated by just one man? That man was Kim Kabon." The director had no idea he was that strong. "He's strong," the captain affirmed. "He has immeasurable power. Hearing those words, the director couldn't believe the captain was admitting his own defeat. However, he had one question for the captain. He wanted to know how he thought Kaibong would fare against the guild leader. At first, Bake said the answer was obvious, but then fell silent. Knowing he couldn't make that judgment, Kim Kaibong and the guild leader were both transcendent beings, beyond the captain's reach. A person with little power couldn't even see past a wall right in front of them. That's why the director knew Bake couldn't possibly say how strong either of them truly was, nor compare them. The captain made it clear that they couldn't recruit Kim Kaibong, as for some reason he held hostility toward them. That would be a major liability. After hearing this, the director stood up, and as he left, told the captain to rest, since he had just woken up after taking the medication and might feel sick later. After leaving the room, the director seemed to have an idea of how to deal with that person. Holding the phone, he called someone and ordered a mission for a mercenary. It was to be sent to the vice leader, who was to take care of the situation. If they couldn't stop him, they would have to eliminate him. The director knew that only then would he no longer stand in their way. Meanwhile, in a 4-star dungeon at the Abyssal Beach, the monster kept growling. It was being attacked by someone, and that person was the protagonist. He continued eliminating every monster that appeared before him. In the middle of all that, he had a question for the system. "What exactly is the Day Stone?" he asked. The system replied that the Day Stone was that black object the protagonist had found. However, that wasn't the answer he was looking for. He was surprised when the system stated that he was able to absorb the stone. This left him quite stunned, so he put his hand in his pocket and held the stone again. He asked the system what the purpose of absorbing the stone was. The system explained that it would have 2 effects once absorbed. The first would be a system upgrade, and the second, access to the origin of the dungeons. As for the origin of the dungeons, that seemed to greatly interest the protagonist. Meanwhile, in the city, life went on, and one person drew attention while walking through the streets. Everyone stared at them, drawn by eccentric conversation and a large hat. They stopped and showed a piece of paper, asking if anyone knew that man. Upon looking at the paper, people were surprised. Back in the 4-star dungeon, the Ober was absorbed by the system. A light began to surround the protagonist. Returning to the city, that mysterious young man showed a strange drawing. People said the subject could have black or white hair, but since the drawing was so badly done, no one could recognize him. The young man, placing his hand on his head, found it all too complicated. Meanwhile, the Ober was absorbed by the protagonist, and the system announced that the stone had been successfully absorbed and that the system was expanding. The young man with the large hat could feel when it happened. With that immense power being absorbed into the system, he was able to locate the protagonist. Taking off his hat, he was now satisfied, for he had found Kim Kaibong. After the Day Stone emitted a glow upon being absorbed, the light covered the hero's body. He watched carefully as the light slowly faded from his hands. Soon after, a message from the system arrived, informing him that the absorption was complete and that the system was now expanding. The protagonist was surprised to discover that a new function had been unlocked. The name of this function was Human Analysis, and it would allow him to scan a player and learn about their status. The protagonist thought this emotional expression function might be interesting. After that, he landed in an area designated for heroes. He deactivated his ability, and his white hair gradually returned to black, while his clothing transformed into a regular suit. He asked the system to find the nearest bus stop, one close to the squad. As he walked down the stairs, the system informed him that the request had been received and that the location had been set. Now all he had to do was walk 1.5 meters to the next bus stop. However, he soon realized that the system had asked him a question. He figured this might be due to the recent system expansion. He then explained to the system that the lieutenant colonel had asked him to walk, not fly. He kept walking but soon noticed he was being followed by someone. He wanted to know who that person in the crowd was, someone in strange clothing who was tailing him. Pretending not to notice, he continued walking, thinking it might be someone from the Shield Guild. He sensed something different about that person. There was no hostility. He thought he might take the opportunity to test the human analysis function, so he asked the system to analyze the person. The system began the scan. Shortly after, the system reported that the analysis had failed, and the protagonist concluded that the upgrade had been useless. Arriving at the bus stop, the protagonist sat down, but warning notifications started to appear. This was due to the young man who had already approached the protagonist. Kim Kaibong looked at that young man with white hair and white eyes, who now stood before him in strange attire. The young man seemed emotional to finally meet the protagonist in person. However, the young man sat quietly in a corner while the protagonist noticed that he smiled every time he looked at him. He also noticed that the young man didn't even try to hide the fact that he was following him. But as soon as the bus arrived, the protagonist got ready to board and presented his transport pass. After that, he looked for a comfortable seat and settled in. He looked outside and noticed that the young man was no longer on that bench. Looking to the side, he realized the young man had already boarded the bus and was now sitting beside him. The protagonist had never felt so surprised since he escaped the awakening zone. He thought about that while the bus continued its route. Far away from there, in a 4-star dungeon, the Serpent Swamp, giant snakes and incredible monsters were on the loose. Someone was clearing that dungeon. That someone had long hair, wore tattered clothes, and wielded a large sword. Even though the snakes were enormous, the man wasn't intimidated and launched fierce attacks. Even in the face of the monsters' hostility, he stared them down and eliminated them one by one. He cut through them all with his sharp blade, a mystical sword capable of causing massive damage. Not even the giant snake stood a chance against that blade or against the man who, with a fierce face and a large scar, continued fulfilling his duty. He kept going like that for a good while, slaying every snake that appeared before him. He walked among them as if nothing had happened, resting his massive sword on his shoulder. However, that man noticed someone approaching. He gripped his sword carefully and hurled it toward the person. With that, a cloud of smoke and dust covered much of the area. After throwing the sword, he waited a while for the person to emerge. From behind a tree, the director simply caught the sword and warned that it had been dangerous. That man with long hair and a big scar was the vice master of the Shield Guild, the Sword Emperor. The man's name was Park Taram, and he spoke to the director, saying how sneaky he still was. The director told the vice master to be more careful with the venom of the giant snakes, but Park reminded the director that he had ordered never to be disturbed. The director explained that since he hadn't received any information, since he literally lived inside the dungeons, he had to come to him directly. However, he got straight to the point. There was someone the vice master needed to eliminate. The man only showed disinterest in eliminating anyone. Upon hearing that the master wanted the special escort unit to be summoned, the director sighed. He said he had already done that, but only one person had managed to defeat them all. That caught the attention of the man with the massive scar. It was known that the special escort unit of the Shield Guild was composed of highly skilled fighters. Even so, the team had never failed a mission, until now. The more he listened, the more interested the vice master became. He placed his greatsword on the ground and said that, until then, he had only been mildly curious. Now the director had his full attention. That woman was not only the prime minister of a country, but also an S-rank player. However, she chose the path of politics to save more players than she could as a warrior. She was the woman standing in front of the guild's vice master. She quickly showed hostility upon seeing Park Taram in front of her. He thought she was being harsh. It had already been 3 years since they last met. The woman simply looked at all the bodyguards lying on the ground, and her expression worsened. She said that 3 years had passed, but she showed no fear. She simply drew her sword and revealed her aura, creating a magic circle beneath her feet. Staring at the man, she asked if he had already forgotten her temperament in just 3 years. When she said that, the bodyguards with her already knew what she was referring to. All of them showed respect and fear before that authority, an S-rank player and the current prime minister. 10 years ago, she was the only one from the first generation to awaken on that day. She was the first awakened, and now she was activating her ability. As soon as she activated the mass teleport spell, a 7-star magic, they were all transported to another place. From afar, one could see the intense glow atop a government building. Left behind were only the bodyguards and the wounded. In the blink of an eye, she had teleported the two of them to a cliff, a place far from civilization. Now after the dust settled, the two stood face to face, swords in hand. Anyone who admired the woman could see she hadn't rusted with time. He already knew that she would teleport them to that location, away from any spectators. While she listened to his words, she was already preparing for battle. Looking seriously at that guild vice master, she informed him that he was under arrest for the crime of treason, saying that she made it clear she was ready for what came next. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the bus was making its stop at the Defense Force headquarters of that city. Quick footsteps descended, with the protagonist followed by the young man who was still tagging along. As the protagonist stepped down, it was striking to see the one walking behind him. Although annoyed, Kim Ki-bong had not said anything to the young man up to that point. Upon arriving at the base, the soldiers, upon seeing him, saluted. They were surprised to see the young man who had been constantly trailing behind the protagonist. One of the soldiers asked if the boy was his brother, but the protagonist simply said he didn't know him. The soldier informed the young man that he was not authorized to enter a military base. Therefore, the protagonist thought he had finally gotten rid of that annoying guy and headed for his dormitory. Upon arrival, he took off his coat and was still thinking about what had happened in the dungeons. He wanted to understand the purpose of dungeon research. Even though he probably wouldn't get an answer from the system, he wasn't sure whether he should acquire more day stones and absorb them. He thought that by doing so, he might make the system a bit smarter than it currently was. While thinking about that, he noticed the young man watching him change through the glass. Within seconds, the guards realized he was peeking through the window of the protagonist's room. He heard noise and, sticking his head out, saw the young man running, fleeing from the soldiers. That's when Kim Ki-bong realized he wouldn't be able to get rid of that young man. Elsewhere, the guild vice master, Park Taram, was still fighting. It was a fierce battle between the prime minister and the guild's vice leader, but the woman wasn't intimidated and the two exchanged blows continuously. After Gu was trying to defend herself against Park's sword, she looked at him with a serious expression. She told him that they should hand over Kim Ki-bong, as that was the request of the guild's vice master. Although he called himself the Emperor of the Sword, she was not going to hand the boy over to him, even though she understood what the Shield Guild wanted, since, thanks to Kim Ki-bong and the recent dungeon breaks, the government had not renewed the Shield Guild's contract for defending the metropolitan area. In fact, he had publicly announced on TV that the Shield Guild's service had been terminated. She knew they would now try to recruit Kim Ki-bong, offering him money and prestige. But that woman was no amateur. She was the first awakened of that world. She already knew that none of them, not even the Shield Guild, had been able to recruit the young man so far. Not with money or prestige had they been able to convince him, and so he dismantled their team. Now their only option was to eliminate him, but the woman warned that he had destroyed any chance of that. Once he had struck their subordinate post, no threat would make her hand over the young man. With that, the man watched the wall of flames the woman created. She did it with a snap of her fingers while staring at him. When she snapped her fingers again, she told him he needed a good lesson for old time's sake. And with that, an intense wave of flames rushed toward the man. Now back at the military security base, that young man was tied up. He was in front of the door, waiting for the protagonist. His team said that since the young man wouldn't move or step away from the door, they simply tied him up. The young man wanted to say something, and already tired of him, the protagonist decided to listen. When asked, the white-haired boy explained that he was following him because he wanted to see what he was like. That made the atmosphere a bit tense, as no one really understood. However, when the young man blushed, the protagonist looked at him with disgust. He wanted to know where that boy thought he knew him from. Smiling, the young man said of course he knew him. That's when he revealed he knew that Kim Ki-bong had come out of the rift. That left the protagonist initially confused, but the young man continued, saying he was curious to know how the protagonist had managed to escape the rift. He said that to understand that, he'd have to observe a bit more. With that, Kim Ki-bong widened his eyes, thinking that maybe the boy knew something about his past, that he might have some idea about everything that had happened over the last 3,000 years. The white-haired young man informed the protagonist that he would be staying under his care for a while longer, so he'd be living with him. When he said that, the vice leader of the protagonist's team placed a blade against his neck. Seriously, he warned the young man that he should know his limits. Still in that position, he warned that he was part of the armed forces. The young man, still excited, asked the man to make him a soldier. The man, enraged, couldn't believe he was hearing such a request. First he got angry, then suddenly started laughing. After that, he got serious and told the young man that it was fine. The protagonist and the rest of the team, already familiar with the vice leader, knew he wouldn't go easy. The man warned the boy that there was a rule if he wanted to join the team. Then, glaring at him with hatred again, he told him he would have to fight and win. The young man listened carefully to what the man said, because only by fighting and winning could he join them. The protagonist tried to intervene, but the vice captain asked him to let it go, as he would handle the situation. The boy needed a lesson for his rude behavior. The white-haired young man posed a question. If he had to beat someone to join the team, that meant he had already beaten them all. When the vice captain heard those words, he turned red with rage. Showing his fury, he told the boy he could face him, since he was the weakest in the group. Back at the site of Park and the minister's fight, the flames of fire were still heading toward the guild's vice leader. However, that man was very sarcastic, and drawing his massive sword, he managed to repel the flames. He startled the prime minister, as she had no idea that sword was a mystical item. And now, the man smiled happily, showing off his scared face. A man remarked that he understood now. He knew she wouldn't hand over the boy willingly, but he was prepared and held a return stone in his hand. The woman could hardly believe he had come prepared to fight her. She tried to rush in and attack him before he could escape. As he fled, he told her to keep defending her title as the strongest warrior. Then he crushed the return stone, meaning he would vanish from there in moments. Thinking she still had a chance to strike the man, the prime minister lunged at him. As he disappeared, the man asked if she would be able to protect her loved ones. After that, a bright light filled the place and the sky. And now only the woman remained, wearing her pair of black high heels. All she could do was look up at the sky as that man departed. The prime minister remained behind, grinding her teeth. She knew the protagonist was strong and certainly ranked, but her rival possessed a mythical grade weapon. The sword named Fang of the Light Dragon was undoubtedly an artifact that made that man the worst possible opponent for Kim Ki-bong. Meanwhile, in the squad, the vice captain accepted the challenge to fight the unknown young man. Visibly upset, he said he was definitely the weakest of them all. But after saying that, he launched himself at the young man. He hoped to land a strike that would reveal his true power. However, the young man simply blocked the kick with his legs. That block caught the vice captain off guard and fueled his anger even more. But the young man had done it all just as a joke. Yet since he wanted to win the fight, he prepared a punch. Right after, he lunged to strike the vice captain's face. The man looked wide-eyed at the boy's fist. The force behind the boy's blow was overwhelming enough to prevent any dodge. He watched the young man's fist approach rapidly, but couldn't avoid it. However, what no one expected was that with just one finger, the protagonist would block the young man's attack. That left the boy wide-eyed, as he hadn't realized that man was so strong. But Captain Kim Ki-bong did it with ease, using only reflex. When the young man realized how easily he had been blocked, a cold sweat ran down his face. After the block, the protagonist waved his fingers in a dismissive gesture. Then he looked at the young man and said he still didn't know his name. And as proper manners dictated, before asking the young man's name, he introduced himself first. That made the boy feel honored by the protagonist's question. So he introduced himself too, saying his name was Kang Hui. When the vice captain reported to the captain, he said that the young man wasn't someone who could be defeated easily. He said that assessing an opponent's strength was an important skill. Upon hearing that, the vice captain became very downcast, as he himself had failed to read the situation. So he simply bowed his head and told the captain he wouldn't repeat the mistake. The protagonist watched as the man clenched his fists for having acted without thinking. However, he stayed silent upon realizing someone else had also acted without thinking. This was the white-haired young man who realized those words were directed at him. Even so, he was pleased to see that the captain gave him some recognition. Kim Ki-bong replied to the young man that he wasn't completely naive. Then he wanted to know if the boy still intended to continue fighting him. The entire squad found it strange that the young man wanted to face someone so much stronger. That was the Special Dungeon Control Team, also known as Kim Ki-bong's team. They had been closely monitored for the past 6 months. They knew the young man was strong because of the barrier incident, but the captain was many times more powerful. Even so, the young man took a stance and declared that he would fight. Meanwhile, the protagonist simply asked where the young man thought he was going. Even after being warned, the boy charged in, trying to fight the protagonist. When the young man's fist approached, he simply dodged it. Even so, Kang Hui kept trying to land at least one hit. With the protagonist growing impatient, the boy received a kick. Right after that, he was told it was payback for kicking the captain's subordinate. The act startled the subordinates who were watching the captain fight. The vice captain was right. It was just as he thought. The captain was many times stronger. However, that kick didn't hit the boy's face. He managed to block it, and that surprised the captain since he had kicked with full strength. Still standing, he decided to strike the young man a few more times to test his endurance. While the boy blocked all the attacks, he asked who the captain was. He also wanted to know who had sent him to that place. The boy, dodging, said it was a secret and kept trying to evade the attacks. After so much back and forth, he launched a kick that sent the protagonist flying. That also caught the captain by surprise, since it had been a long time since he was launched like that. It only increased his interest in the boy. Kang Hui told the captain not to be so surprised just yet. Then he unleashed a bright and intense energy blast. It got very close to the protagonist's face. It didn't land because the captain was fast enough to dodge it. Even so, there were still many questions about the young man. He wanted to know what kind of attack that was, if it was pure magic, though deep down it felt like something else. Once he landed on the ground again, he asked the boy if that was chi. The young man just gave a smile and, grinning even more, said it was something like that. Opening his hands again, he prepared to launch another attack, and from them, another beam shot toward the protagonist. Everything filled with dust that blocked vision. The boy just waited for the dust to settle to see what had happened. To be safe, he decided to strike the same spot several times to ensure victory. Meanwhile, the captain's team watched, stunned, unable to do anything. Now the vice captain knew that the young man wasn't just anyone, but still wasn't that strong either. After several blows in the same direction, he believed he had managed to defeat the captain. The dust gradually cleared while the young man waited for the result. He was frustrated to see a silhouette forming within the dust. Annoyed, the protagonist told the boy that he had just attracted someone even stronger. Kang Hui, still playful, didn't mind. He said that the man really was strong. He told the captain that he didn't think he would walk away unscathed after so many hits. But that wasn't how the protagonist saw it, as his clothes were burned and torn. After that, he asked if the boy was finished, because his fists now indicated it was his turn. Knowing he didn't stand a chance, the white-haired boy shouted that he gave up. That caused a stir among the captain's group. But that white-haired boy, pointing at the vice captain, said he could join the team since he had defeated him. Now grinning from ear to ear, he said he would be under Kim Ki-bong's care. However, the captain warned that he had never said it was over. While the boy was still feeling satisfied, he took a punch to the face. And of course, with the captain's strength, the boy was sent flying. He landed legs up, having hit the ground headfirst. After that, the protagonist walked away and, with his back turned, told his soldiers to take care of the rookie. They simply couldn't believe that the boy would actually be part of their team. and they also couldn't believe that a monster like him would be considered a rookie. Meanwhile, the boy lay half unconscious on the ground, elsewhere, in a dungeon in the ancient fields, the nesting site of the fire dragon. That was an 8-star ranked dungeon, the highest existing, and everyone feared the dragon's awakening. Everyone except one person. The vice leader of the Shield Guild knew that if the dragon awakened, everyone would need his guild to contain the damage. And that's why he captured a baby fire dragon. The intention was clear. He wanted to awaken the dragon later, so that afterward he could unleash it to destroy the city. He wanted everything to descend into absolute chaos. After all, the fire dragon was an enemy extremely difficult to combat, and he didn't know anyone capable of handling it if it were to awaken. Some events took place 10 minutes before the dragon's awakening. Before that, a hatchling had been captured. The creature was injured and screaming. It was clear the adult dragon would hear the sound. The director found the situation very problematic. Even though it was just a hatchling, it was still a fire dragon. While holding his cigar, Park Taram simply watched the man. Impatiently, he asked the director to stop with the rambling. He wanted to know how that would draw attention. The director continued smoking his cigar, amused by the Vice Guild leader's questions. Then he revealed that it would be quite simple. And as he said that, he crouched and looked into the baby dragon's eyes. He began to lay out the plan. They would eliminate the hatchling to awaken the adult fire dragon. He knew that once signs of the awakened dragon were detected, the government would send special forces. The Vice Guild leader listened carefully to the director. Everything lined up, and to stop the fire dragon, they would need to call Kim. However, he wanted to know how they would deal with the enraged dragon afterward. The director reached into his pocket and said that was a crucial part of the plan. He declared he would use the Daystone to seal the dragon. Park Taram was surprised to see that the director had a Daystone. Looking at the baby dragon, the director explained that they had conducted experiments using the Daystone, and the Vice Guild leader now realized it could be used to seal the dragon. Without hesitation, he drew his sword and pierced the dragon. The hatchling screamed loudly until its strength was completely gone. Seeing that everything had reached the desired point, Park Taram began to laugh, and laughed maniacally like a madman. While laughing, he said he really liked the plan. He shouted to the adult fire dragon, calling it to come and summon Kim Ki-bon. Meanwhile, at a playground, children were playing as usual, until one of them noticed something strange, and his mother reacted upon seeing how he looked up at the sky. She asked her son what was wrong, and he pointed to the clouds. When the woman looked up, she noticed the sky had turned an unusual shade of red. Now both of them stared at the sky, confused about what was happening. Quickly, the army and peacekeeping patrols were notified. Helicopters flew over the city through the crimson clouds. Reporters and news outlets broadcasted that the situation was an emergency. With that, residents saw on TV that all citizens were to evacuate immediately. Everyone in front of the big screen who heard the message began to worry. The sky wasn't just red, it was filled with several government jets. Citizens faced chaos and confusion as the government declared martial law. It was a situation similar to what happened 10 years ago. Experts and commentators shared their opinions with the public. A major scholar and expert on the subject said that a catastrophe had befallen them all. He mentioned that there had been a similar case in Russia, which is why they gave up on clearing dungeons the traditional way. Citizens now recalled that Russia had used nuclear warheads in uninhabited regions at the time. Everyone understood that the chaos from 10 years ago had returned to the country. The Prime Minister struggled to deal with the crisis caused by the Shield Guild. Inside a helicopter, she asked a subordinate to contact the intelligence service. She wanted to know where the country's president was. One of her subordinates informed her that the president had been sent to a bunker. That left the Prime Minister with full authority, but she knew she was authorized to die in his place. Everyone was informed that destiny was just ahead, only 3 kilometers from the impact zone. From a distance, they could already see a containment field affected by the dragon. The Prime Minister watched everything from above. She took action, requesting that emergency alerts be sent to all guild masters. Meanwhile, experts said the government would surely respond to the situation. In truth, it was the Prime Minister taking initiative, asking for all top 100 players to be summoned. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation worsened. Near the impacted zone, the protagonist and his team arrived. He looked at the place and told everyone they had finally arrived, while the vice captain and the rest of the team trembled. The captain tried to stay calm, but he couldn't, even knowing this was their duty. It was no secret to anyone that they were the sacrificial pawns. They needed to buy time. The fire dragon was an enemy none of them could face, and once they crossed the barrier, everyone knew they certainly wouldn't survive. While they were getting ready to enter, the young Kang Hui appeared, excited about everything. He was jumping with joy, saying the area was huge and everything was thrilling. He spoke loudly and excitedly, asking if that was the fire dragon's home. Because of that, the vice captain asked Kim what they should do about that person. The protagonist asked them to let him stay. After all, he had followed the group all the way there and could be useful. The order was given, everyone would enter, starting with the captain. Following the captain, everyone tried to enter the area. However, they were pushed back, not understanding why they couldn't get in. The vice captain panicked. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had never been ejected from a dungeon before. When the protagonist looked back, he saw that his companions hadn't been able to enter. This was the first 8-star dungeon. He didn't know if all of them were like that. He sighed and thought he'd have to handle everything alone, until he looked to the side. Suddenly, the white-haired boy appeared, smiling. That startled the protagonist. He didn't know how he had crossed the barrier, but he didn't want to waste time with that kind of conversation. In the little time they had stood still, they were already under someone else's gaze. Someone was approaching quickly, clearly targeting the protagonist. The arrival of that person didn't go unnoticed. Kim Ki-bong turned and noticed their presence. When he looked, he couldn't believe someone was already trying to strike him. That person was the vice leader of the guild, eager for that encounter. He stared with a crazed expression. When the protagonist looked at the man, he realized he was faster than anyone he had ever fought. So he had to use his enhanced body form, turning his hair and eyes white. He raised his hand to block the blow the vice leader of the guild was launching at him. However, he felt the impact. It was the first time he had ever been cut. The cut was on his shoulder and seemed serious. The system warned that his defense had been ignored. Meanwhile, the helicopter carrying the Prime Minister flew over that area, and the first top 100 players who had been summoned began to arrive. One of the many players observing the scene knew it was a bad situation. While that player looked up, he saw helicopters flying overhead and the red sky. That player watching was Chin Yubin, 4th in the official ranking, and he had also received the top 100 notification. When he picked up his phone, he checked the emergency alert. He simply sighed, knowing this was a very complicated situation. In another place, someone was recording the scene. She was another top 100 player. Besides being a player, she also loved streaming and dedicating herself to her audience. That young woman was Yu, ranked number 99 officially, and she was excitedly showing the red sky. She concluded that the fire dragon had really awakened, while a small white cat rested on her shoulder. While streaming, she was also notified. It was an emergency call. Like the others, she knew she couldn't ignore the emergency summons. Because of that, other ranked players were informed about what was happening. It was the emergency notification of martial law, declaring the summoning of the top 100 players. And in that scene of destruction and red skies, the protagonist began bleeding for the first time in a long while. He was frightened. That wasn't something that happened often. Being wounded felt strange to him, especially because he had never been hurt while in his awakened state. And that wasn't even the worst part. His defense had been completely ignored, while the man in front of him said he had high expectations. And now he was disappointed, saying it with that massive sword resting on his shoulder. The protagonist just furrowed his brow and glared at the man, noticing the guild tattoo on his arm, the Shield Guild. He scoffed, thinking how awful that moment was, but his priority was still the fire dragon. So he turned his back to the man and told him to leave. He didn't have time to play. With that, the guild's vice master launched another attack at the hero, just to get his attention, and said he shouldn't be worried about a fire dragon, since he had an opponent more than worthy standing right in front of him. But the protagonist didn't see it that way. He still had an open wound but decided to tear off the upper part of his clothing completely, revealing his muscles and the injury. Taking a battle stance, he told the enemy they should end that quickly. And once again, the hero lunged at his enemy and prepared a powerful strike. The attack seemed quite powerful because as soon as he regained his stance, lights could be seen surrounding him. Even his opponent was startled, thinking such an attack could be fatal. After the dust settled, the hero was seen, and it looked like he had been struck instead of landing the blow. The entity before him, although initially surprised, knew that his blade was mythical. Meanwhile, from atop a cliff in the distance, the director and other members of the Shield Guild were watching. The director, with his cigar in his mouth, was simply amused by the scene. He burst into laughter upon seeing the hero struck by his own attack. At the same time, the protagonist didn't understand what had happened. Once again, he had been hit, while the enemy simply watched the man lying on the ground, feeling lucky to possess a mythical sword. The sphere covering the area where the dragon was began glowing intensely after the attack. With that, the captain's team could tell from the outside that he had already begun the battle. Unfortunately, they couldn't even get close to the captain. All they could do was stand outside and watch. Soon, the sound of high heels was heard. That drew the vice captain's attention, and he turned to see who it was. When he recognized the Prime Minister, everyone turned in her direction. They greeted her along with the 2 bodyguards who always accompanied her. The woman was direct. She wanted to know where their captain was and why they hadn't gone in to help. And when they explained they couldn't enter due to the fire dragon's barrier, the woman stepped forward. She touched the barrier to assess what was going on. She remained silent for a moment, reflecting, and then said the barrier hadn't been made by the dragon. It was a barrier created by the Shield Guild. She knew they would do anything To make things worse, she noticed the press was also at the scene. They were all there due to the alert and the announcement about the fire dragon. The Prime Minister ordered her bodyguards to get those reporters under control immediately. However, they warned her it was impossible. These weren't just domestic news agencies. The Prime Minister was told that international agencies were among them too. The battle continued fiercely and was taking on strange proportions within the barrier. The enemy was delighted to see he was able to damage the captain, and he kept pushing forward to deal as much damage as possible. From afar, the director was still cheerful, because the Fang of the Light Dragon was a fantastic sword. It was the most powerful weapon of the guild's vice master, obtained in a 7-star dungeon. The director explained to his group that although the sword was large, it was light and extremely sharp. These people had already heard rumors about the sword. It was a mythical grade weapon. The director went on, saying that the Fang of the Light Dragon was a mythical item enchanted with countless spells. Observing Kim Ki-bong's condition, he explained that among its most famous enchantments was reflection. The system had also informed Kim that the Fang of the Light Dragon could reflect all the damage the blade received. Now he understood. That's why he had been hurt by his own earlier attacks. Kim Ki-bong realized that the sword ignored defense and reflected attacks. It was a very interesting weapon. While the captain spoke to himself, the enemy watched his disregard for the battle. So he gripped his sword tighter, thinking the man could keep daydreaming until he was punished. With that, and full of anger, he got into position for more strikes. With hatred in his eyes and his teeth clenched, he rushed at the protagonist, and once again delivered a blow, and this time too it was a serious wound. Now the player once again had an open wound, while the enemy simply passed by him. After passing him, the enemy wore a strange expression. He didn't seem satisfied despite being in control. And the protagonist, even though he'd been injured, oddly asked the enemy for the sword. This puzzled Park Taram, but even so, he extended his hands and said that weapon would be perfect. The enemy was so stunned that he stood there, mouth agape and eyes wide. The shock came not only from what was said to him, but also from the fact that the player was still standing. Kim Ki-bong just scratched his head. He didn't understand what that man was trying to say. He said that man probably just had more endurance than most people. The player thought all of this had happened because the system was slow to notify him about the sword. Those words were hard for the enemy to accept, and he continued to bare his teeth. In the middle of an attack, he shouted for the protagonist not to mock him. With a bored look, the white-haired young man said that he was the one putting himself in that position. Saying that, the protagonist lunged to attack the man again. The impact of the blow was noticeable from afar and on a large scale, and once again, the enemy blocked the strike using his mythical sword. The protagonist kept attacking the enemy even knowing the damage would be reflected again. And now, with the strike dealt and the damage counted against him, he continued to feel it throughout his body. Despite that, he held nothing back. He showed no signs of weakness. Unlike the enemy, who was trembling, the guild's vice master couldn't understand. He believed the man in front of him should have been finished a long time ago. Park Taram, still holding his sword, glanced behind and saw the extent of the destruction. He knew that if he hadn't blocked, he never would have survived such a powerful attack. And of course, after such a grand strike, the hero began to feel the consequences. Even so, he smiled and told the enemy that, as expected from one of his own attacks, that hurt. Clenching his fist, he told the enemy he already knew that weapon reflected his attacks. With a serious expression, he said he wanted to see how much the man could reflect. As expected, the dragon began to show signs of evolution. It slammed its tail to break the shield that contained it. It was already causing multiple cracks in that protective layer, trying to escape. That creature was something else. A furious dragon with glowing features and peculiar eyes. The beast was ferocious and launched powerful flame attacks at the barrier to break through it. From afar, the director could hear the dragon thrashing and striking. Seeing that his team was terrified, he told them there was no reason to panic. He explained that it wasn't something easy to break, especially being an 8-star dungeon. Even with the dragon extremely enraged, the director thought he still had some time. But that monster, with 2 eyes on each side, growled furiously. Standing still amid its own flames, it roared with hatred at those despicable humans. The director knew that, even though he had told his subordinates to remain calm, the barrier was weakening. It was no surprise it was an 8-star boss monster. Holding the sun sphere, the director thought he should stay alert. Maybe he'd have to use that stone. Looking at the chaos, he hoped the vice master would finish off the boy quickly. Before the moment arrived, as he was saying that out loud, while the director spoke, someone asked who he was referring to, and he said it was about the captain. He was so distracted that he didn't resist when the young Kankwi approached him. Then he looked to the side and noticed the presence of that cheerful young man, mouth wide open. The director couldn't believe it. He ordered his henchmen to seize that person, since he was with the protagonist. Meanwhile, in the fight, Kim Ki-bong continued battling against that sword and its resistance. He struck harder and harder, and when he did, he felt the effects of the dragon fang. When the effect was triggered, his hands trembled. The effect on his body was clear, as the damage had already been reflected. Meanwhile, the guild's vice master just watched. waiting for the final blow to land soon. Seeing the damage on his opponent's body, Park Taram was confident, relying on his mythical grade weapon. He believed the battle was already won, since his opponent relied on physical attacks, so he told him to just give up. He thought the enemy had no chance of winning, until he noticed something. The man in front of him kept attacking harder and harder, not caring about the damage to his own body. The last strike caused an extremely high amount of reflected damage to the player. That made the vice leader of the Shield Guild think the man was insane. Even so, the protagonist didn't care about his rival's words or thoughts, and he kept charging forward. He didn't want to waste time with someone from that guild, so there were no more words between the two, and the protagonist launched even more powerful blows to test the sword's durability and how much that man could still block. Park Taram was already getting tired, and his legs were starting to weaken. Meanwhile, the captain in front of him didn't stop. Outside the barrier, helicopters still hovered, while the Prime Minister and the captain's companions remained outside with a terrible feeling. Upon hearing it, their captain sensed something. He called out to the Prime Minister. There were massive tremors. She knew they weren't from the fire dragon. They were from the hero. That's why she showed her rage, baring her teeth, and tried to touch the barrier to feel something more. When someone arrived and asked her not to destroy the barrier, saying it would put many people in danger, that bodyguard asked her to calm her emotions, reminding her that she was now the supreme commander. If she joined the battle, she would leave her post unattended, and even with the top 100 rankings, it would be difficult. He tried to convince the minister that if this happened, it would be the end of the nation. The more he spoke, the more upset she became because she knew he was right. Meanwhile, inside the barrier, the dust kept rising, and when it settled, the two were once again revealed. The vice leader of the guild couldn't understand how that man still hadn't been defeated, and when the hero paused for a moment, he thought it was finally over, since his physical state kept worsening. But the hero looked intensely at the man, who, perhaps nervously, started to smile, calling the hero a damned monster, while Kim Ki-bong just stood still, until he clenched his fist, showing he was ready to continue fighting. He asked the man in front of him if he would keep trying to block. Then he launched more attacks, luminous like nearly all the attacks he delivered, and firmly the enemy gripped the sword, trying to block as much as he could. In his mind, he just needed to hold out until that hero was finally defeated. It was an absurd and bizarre battle. One side kept attacking while the other defended. However, the only one getting hurt was the attacker. At a certain point, the vice master of the Shield Guild began to tremble in the legs. He could barely keep his balance. The rival's strikes were too strong, and because of that, even he got hit, suffering his first damage. But he still didn't understand how he had taken the hit, since the fang of the light dragon was supposed to reflect. When he looked at the sword, he noticed a small crack, and it was through that crack that the damage got through. Now he was worried about that crack and simply stared at it, sweat dripping. He hadn't even managed to stand back up, and he knew that if it went on like this, he would be the one defeated. But the hero looked down on him with a sinister voice, telling the enemy to keep blocking. Now without his usual smile, Park Taram felt sweat running down his face. As the hero prepared to strike again, the enemy only begged him to wait. He knew that this next blow would be the final one, and it could truly be the end for him. Kim Ki-bong wasn't listening to anyone anymore, and the attack he launched toward the enemy was massive. Once again, the enemy defended, hiding behind the sword, but this time, the attack was different. And because it wore the sword down a bit more, it caused damage to the enemy again. The protagonist didn't stop there, he kept striking. The sword was already deteriorating, the cracks were countless, until finally it shattered, and the punch moved in slow motion to the enemy's eyes. He saw the hero's fist slowly approaching his face, until he was finally struck. With that, the ground around them was violently shattered, revealing the enemy was unconscious. And now the enemy was lying on the ground with his face severely damaged. However, the hero wasn't in the best condition either, as he had taken a lot of damage. He looked at the sword on the ground with dissatisfaction. His hair turned from white back to black, showing that he had deactivated his ability. Meanwhile, in another scene, the white-haired young man was running, being chased by agents from the Shield Guild. At one point, he stopped and told the pursuers that Kim Ki-bong had won the fight. That startled the agents, so much so that they turned to look in the direction of the battle to see for themselves. Down below, the protagonist picked up the sword and examined the piece that remained. None of the agents atop the cliff could believe the battle had actually ended. Upon seeing the vice master unconscious on the ground, they couldn't believe he had lost. The director couldn't believe his magnificent sword had been broken. Even less that the guild's vice master, someone in the top 3 of the top 100, had been defeated. Everyone knew the Shield Guild committed countless acts that defied common sense, but due to a certain precondition, all logic collapsed at that moment. This happened solely because of one player, Kim Ki-bong. The agents asked the director what they were going to do from that moment on. The guild's plan had been to awaken the fire dragon and lure the protagonist, to have the guild leader, Park Taram, eliminate him, so that the director could then seal the dragon using the Daystone. That way, the world would honor Kim Ki-bong as the hero who died trying to stop the fire dragon alone. However, the director believed that forgotten heroes posed no threat and assumed that the Prime Minister had no evidence against them. At least that's what he believed, and wanted to keep believing. Wishing to return, he ordered everyone to use their return stones. One of the agents asked if they weren't going to use the Sun Stone before the dragon broke the barrier. The director stated that even if the top 100 were summoned, the chance of success would still be low. That subordinate didn't understand why they were proceeding with something like that. The director, with a cigar in his mouth, explained that he would return during the climax of the battle to use the Sunstone at the decisive moment, which left everyone in shock. Holding the orb, he said that although it differed from the original plan, the results would be similar. Turning around, he ordered everyone to get out of there as quickly as possible. Even so, there were still doubts about the guild's vice master. He remained unconscious among the rubble. The director looked down from above and coldly analyzed the vice leader's situation. After that, he told his subordinates to leave him behind. They couldn't understand. After all, that was the vice leader of the guild. The director looked back and stated that if they wanted, they could go down and try to save him themselves. The problem was that below, the protagonist was staring at them. Kim Ki-bong's cold gaze gave none of the agents the courage to attempt a rescue. Even the director, upon looking down, felt intimidated by that figure. So he just tossed away the cigar, and they all used the return stone. They formed a circle, and the magic activated, causing them all to vanish. The top of the hill glowed with the energy of that magic. The protagonist simply watched as they fled. Frightened, Kang Hui asked if he wasn't going to go after them. The protagonist told him to forget it. There were other problems to deal with. He was referring to the dragon's awakening. The dragon remained furious, trying to break the barrier and escape the dungeon. That creature would do anything to get out and devastate humanity. Outside, reporters were noticing that the cracks in the barrier were increasing. A specialist calculated that the damage had reached 89%, and the structure wouldn't last more than 5 minutes. Upon hearing that, the Prime Minister became thoughtful and concerned. Another man asked if she wasn't going to take any action. The woman responsible for measuring the barrier was startled by the question. Everyone realized the situation was critical, and the reporters weren't missing a single detail. Even the journalists, usually distant, were worried. They believed that was the fire dragon. When the dust settled, they could clearly see the beast with its enormous wings. The panicked woman insisted that the barrier was still holding. She hadn't seen the dragon before because a secondary inner barrier had blocked visibility. The Prime Minister gently touched the barrier to feel its energy. She suspected that the Shield Guild had removed its own protection. Head lowered, she thought they had succeeded in their goal of eliminating the hero. At that moment, a scream was heard, and the reporters noticed there were people inside the barrier. Upon hearing that, the Prime Minister lifted her head, eyes wide open. She managed to see the silhouettes of 2 people inside the barrier. She felt satisfied, thinking that must be the hero who had defeated the guild. The reporters took pictures of the 2 figures present. They also noticed that the guild's vice leader lay unconscious on the ground. As she listened to the comments about the possibility of it being Park Taram, the Prime Minister was overjoyed. She now knew that the hero had fulfilled his mission. Alone, he had defeated the guild's vice leader. Not even she knew the boy had that much power. She asked her aides if there was any way to reach those people. They replied that they were trying to make contact via radio, but the dungeon's waves blocked transmission. She watched the monster roar louder and louder. It unleashed bursts of fire, further damaging the barrier. The analysis showed that fragility had reached 97%, and the collapse was imminent. The Prime Minister knew she had to delay it at all costs. The fire dragon couldn't be contained. She looked at the players present but knew not all of them had arrived. There were only 30 out of 100. She needed at least 80. That's when they informed her they had made contact with the hero. She immediately asked for the radio transmitter to speak with him. Even with a weak signal, she managed to hear something. With a firm voice, she asked who she was speaking to, because she knew it wasn't Kim Ki-bong. On the other end, listening through the headphones, the white-haired young man identified himself. She asked him to put the hero on the line. Quickly, the young man began speaking to the Prime Minister. She asked for news about his condition. He replied that somehow, everything was under control and he was still fine. She was relieved to hear that, but she had to make a difficult request. She hesitated for a second, bit her lip, reluctant to speak. Her eyes showed sorrow, but she had to fulfill her duty. Feeling the silence on the line, he asked what the orders were. The Prime Minister entered a trance. She remained silent, sweat running down her face and lips tightly shut. Unwilling to say the words, but forced by her position, she ordered him to buy them time. As soon as he heard it, he knew he had been sentenced. She was asking him to sacrifice himself for everyone. The communication became unstable, and she couldn't hear anything else. So distraught, she let the radio fall to the ground, clenching her fists. While the reporters narrated everything, they said 2 people were advancing. The cameras showed them heading straight toward the fire dragon. An irritated man asked who was that person advancing without support. The Prime Minister just turned to him, upset with a deadly look, and ordered him to be quiet. The man understood the situation was serious. She stated that this was the country's future and its hope. She said she had ordered the only person capable of saving them all to sacrifice himself. As she explained this, the protagonist was already walking, his white hair flowing. He calmly advanced toward the fire dragon, even though his HP was dangerously low. His injuries still hadn't been properly treated, and the system kept warning him that his health was low, at that moment below 8%. The recommendation was to take a break and rest. The hero also wanted to rest, if possible. While the system kept insisting he needed rest because of his low health, he simply said he couldn't. The system offered him a way to escape easily, without having to fight. But the hero said he couldn't. If he ran away, everything would be destroyed, and he'd put his mother in danger. So the system suggested that he flee to another country together with his mother. While he was tormented by the system, the white-haired young man called out to him. Kang Wei, seeing that gigantic beast before them, asked if that was the monster they were going to fight. Kim Ki-bong told the boy that yes, they would have to fight it. But the white-haired young man didn't seem afraid. He thought it was amazing to fight something so powerful. The fire dragon grew more and more enraged, already launching its flaming blasts. Each blast covered a massive area of that uninhabitable territory, surrounded by a containment field. Outside the barrier, the analyst reported that an explosion had been detected inside. After analysis, she concluded the barrier hadn't broken yet, but the flames were extremely intense. The Prime Minister felt even more terrified, but she had to maintain her role as a strong woman. The place where the dragon had launched its fiery breath was in ruins, more devastated than before. Kim Ki-bong was lucky that the young man reacted quickly and managed to block the dragon's attack. Even Kang Hui sighed in relief after realizing he'd managed to block it just in time. He had barely made it. His quick reaction also deeply impressed the protagonist. He had already sensed that power before and asked if it was related to himself. The young man, excited, replied that it was similar, but more precise. And just as he was about to give exact instructions on what that power referred to, he was interrupted by a blow from the dragon that sent him flying. After that, the young man fell far away, while the hero just looked back to track his trajectory. With that hit, the young man would definitely be out cold for a while. Thus, the protagonist concluded that once again, he had been interrupted right in the middle of an explanation. But looking at the dragon, he declared that now it was just the two of them, and he couldn't hold back. So calling the huge dragon a lizard, he told it to come at him. Even without understanding the human's words, the dragon knew it was being insulted and provoked. It tried to mimic the hero too, but the protagonist was far too fast and dodged. If that blow had landed, it would have been truly devastating, and so the monster kept trying repeatedly to see if it could hit him. But the protagonist was far too quick, leaping upward, always blocking every attack. This enraged the dragon greatly. It only wanted to crush that human. When it swung its tail at the hero, he simply stopped it with his hands. Even with his body still severely injured, the protagonist still had incredible strength. Though that effort caused his wounds to reopen, the system warned him to be careful. His health was now below 7%, but neither the hero nor the dragon backed down. Both felt the urgency to end it all. The protagonist kept watching the dragon and once again managed to block its attack. Even though the dragon's tail strike was immensely strong, the hero not only blocked it but also threw the tail aside. This made the dragon even more furious, but now it was the protagonist's turn to attack. He clenched his fist and headed toward the dragon without hesitating even once. Now he was in the air, getting close to reaching the dragon. The massive monster also saw that the hero was launching himself through the air like lightning to strike him, and even though it saw it couldn't block the attack that caused the dragon's head to be thrown to the side, the dragon was hurled away and a cloud of dust rose once again. Now with the dragon slammed to the ground, the hero had less than 4% of his health left. The system warned that the backlash from his own attacks was reducing his health. Even knowing and feeling in his body everything the system reported, the protagonist couldn't stop. He had someone to save, and for that reason he had to finish the fight quickly. Meanwhile, the dragon launched another one of its fireballs. The flames spewing from its mouth were massive. Now the hero was directly in front of one. He knew it was a bad scenario. He needed to dodge as quickly as possible. The hero's judgment was correct. The breath of an 8-star dragon was so hot it could melt anything. And since the tribute to resistance skill wasn't enough to guarantee his safety from those flames, and he no longer had Kang Hui's support, there was no choice but to avoid the attack. It was a fatal strike that could bring him down due to his low health. However, the hero knew that if that blast hit the barrier, it would be destroyed. So he feared something worse and looked back, thinking of what he could do. Outside the barrier, everyone could see the dragon's breath heading toward the structure. Even though it was dangerous, the reporters and photographers stayed in place. The barrier was already at its limit. The chances of the breath destroying it were high. That's why the Prime Minister shouted that everyone should flee as quickly as possible. And what no one expected happened. The white-haired young man positioned himself at the right place and time. Focusing his power into the palm of his hand, he was prepared to block. Just as he had done before, he would strike the dragon's blow and contain the flames. Even though it was a bit difficult and he was sweating while trying to execute the move, he seemed to be managing. The Prime Minister, along with others, watched from outside as he stood in front of the barrier. Even she didn't know who that young man was, just like everyone else wanted to find out. Although the fire was contained, the barrier was becoming more and more fragile. After managing to block that massive blow from the dragon, the young man was thrown back. Gradually, he fell from above into a pile of rubble. Exhausted, he slowly stood up, but joy filled him as he realized he had succeeded. He raised his arms high and shouted that he had done it. That made the dragon even more enraged, but on the other hand, it also made the hero feel quite proud. From where he stood, he shouted to the boy that he had done a good job. Kang Kuei, all happy, said to the captain that it was nothing. Now back in the fight, the protagonist and the dragon face each other. The protagonist told the dragon they should end this. The dragon, simply watching, also seemed to agree. Kim Ki-bong, looking down at the dragon that was growling heavily, knew he needed to act, as the dragon was already preparing another attack. That looked like the biggest energy sphere it had launched so far. So the hero got ready as well. His fist was charged with electricity. The electricity was so intense it surged throughout his entire body. Both of them were clearly giving everything they had to end the fight quickly. He launched himself toward the dragon and that massive fireball. Head on, he was ready for his strike. He landed the blow right in the center of the dragon as soon as he could. And he didn't land just one blow, but several. It looked like a festival of lights surrounding the dragon. Everything intensified as the hero was incredibly fast. After a rain of blows, he finally landed, already exhausted. When he placed his fist on the ground, the system announced that the boss had been defeated, and he had increased his strength. After defeating an 8-star boss, he gained other stat boosts. He obtained the unique skill First Dragon Slayer. Now he could deal an additional 50% damage. Even after all that, when returning to his normal state, with black hair and brown eyes, his HP was even lower. Now that the dragon was defeated, the hero simply walked away from the area, while the system notified him that his health was below 3%. The warning that he needed treatment was constant. As the system spoke, the white-haired young man ran toward the protagonist. Satisfied, he spoke about how he had blocked the fire dragon's breath. While he was excited, the system kept telling the protagonist that he needed to be treated. And at a certain point, things got worse for him. Turning around, he noticed something unusual happening. When he realized what it was, his eyes widened and he began to sweat. The fire dragon's body, specifically its heart, contained a large mass of energy. Now that dragon was showing signs of a possible explosion. When the hero took down the monster, it hadn't yet exhausted all of its energy, and that's why it was about to explode. The flash could be seen from far away. Still facing backward, not only the protagonist but also Kang saw what was about to happen, and slowly the light engulfed both of their bodies. It was the ignition of a massive explosion, which could even be felt outside the barrier by the Prime Minister. The specialist reported that they had detected the fire dragon's energy, and the Prime Minister demanded to know what was happening inside the barrier. However, the specialist said all the top-ranked agents had arrived, except for those affiliated with the Shield Guild. The troops were ready to provide support, even though she knew the soldiers were there and reinforced by other ranked operatives. The Prime Minister showed signs of hesitation as she pressed her lips together. But it didn't last long. Quickly, she drew her sword with a determined expression. She believed it was time to destroy the barrier. However, when she looked at the barrier, she noticed something strange. Of the two barriers, one had vanished, and now the scene inside could be seen. She found it odd, because the barrier had been undone. A small crack had become visible. The people near the barrier thought it was snowing, as flakes of ash began to fall from the sky. They all looked upward, including some special ranked operatives. But the Prime Minister knew that wasn't snow, and with one small flake in her hand, she knew she had to do something. So she ran in her high heels toward the barrier. Everyone saw that woman running toward the barrier with determination. Even though people called out to the Prime Minister, she was no longer listening to anyone. She knew all of it was ash, and undeterred, she ran even faster. In her heart, she wished that the hero was still alive. In the rubble, she searched for Kim Ki-bong. At one moment, she stopped, looking around, hoping to find him. Looking down into a large crater, she grew sad, thinking everything might have ended badly. From above, she looked for the hero and called out for him. When she was suddenly approached by another young man, the one with white hair, he looked at her with warmth, though she didn't know who he was. She asked him where the hero was, and he said he didn't know, but he was trying to help. When he finally spotted something, he pointed to let her know where the hero was. Pointing his finger in that direction, they could see that the protagonist was leaning against what was left of some rubble. He was visibly worn out and extremely weak, but he still held the posture of a hero. Seeing him, the Prime Minister was stunned, frozen at first. Soon she walked toward him, until she got close enough to praise him for a job well done. The protagonist sighed. He seemed emotional, though he was badly weakened. Even so, he had earned a new innate trait, Dragon's Dread. Meanwhile, a helicopter hovered above, capturing from the air the hero and the Prime Minister. After everything had calmed down, a cleanup was underway at the headquarters of the Shield Guild, and the secretary quickly informed the director that the reconnaissance team had reported in. But the director, with a cigar in his mouth, only listened to his anxious subordinate. The director tossed his cigar on the ground and walked calmly and silently, while the subordinate didn't understand what was happening. Even so, he kept calling for the director, who simply walked away with his back turned. Now in the headline of the day, it was stated that the government had officially cleared another dungeon. It had been revealed that the clearing was done by a single agent sent by the Department of Defense. Reporters were going wild with the information that was coming in. They were talking about the search and seizure conducted against the members of the Shield Guild. The Prime Minister had personally led the operation and arrested every member of that guild. Even the Vice Master of the Shield Guild was being taken to prison. However, it was reported that the director was now a fugitive. After that, the news became increasingly favorable, and all the journalists wanted to speak with the hero. The cameras were positioned for another official statement, and now it would be delivered by the Prime Minister. She began by saying that she was happy to greet everyone once again. Several newspapers and journalists wanted to ask their questions first, but she believed that everyone was already there and had been updated on what the government had announced. Pointing her hand to one side, she showed that this was the person responsible for everything. And when she said that, she pointed to the captain of the Special Dungeon Management Team. Meanwhile, the protagonist felt uncomfortable in that suit and surrounded by people, but he would have to walk toward that crowd. Despite the flashes and so many questions intimidating him, he smiled while sweating, saying it was a pleasure to meet everyone. Even though everyone already knew him, he introduced himself formally once more. After the interview, the hero was taken to a military research and technology facility. He walked, apparently a bit tired, while at his side Kang seemed completely full of energy. And when someone called the protagonist's attention, the white-haired young man wanted to know who it was. It was the lieutenant, greeting the protagonist for his heroic act. And while the hero rubbed the back of his head saying it was nothing, the white-haired boy wanted attention. As soon as he got a compliment, he became extremely excited, telling Kim how he always looked uncomfortable around him. On that occasion, the white-haired boy crossed the line and got a flick to the ear. As they got closer, the protagonist asked him to be quiet and stay still. Kang, now with his ear red, remained silent while the lieutenant chuckled. She was confirming that it was the hero's first time at that facility. He replied yes, and in the background Kang seemed intrigued by something. Kim Ki-bong confirmed that it was indeed his first time in that facility, saying that he looked up and also to the sides. He seemed to have a question, so he called the lieutenant. He wanted to know who those people around them were since he had noticed filming equipment. Looking at that filming crew with cameras and staff, he didn't feel excited. All those people were getting ready for new recordings. She, looking at his still bothered face, told him that he was a national hero, and that was normal. Smiling brightly, she said that people were usually very interested in heroes. Hearing that, the white-haired young man got really excited as he already considered himself a hero. The lieutenant, looking at him, commented that she had even heard he had a fan club. With that, the hero once again had to restrain Kang to get his chance to talk to the lieutenant. She made it clear that they were there for his physical evaluation. She explained that back when he enlisted, they didn't have proper equipment, and they thought that since technology had changed so much, they could now get an accurate reading. The protagonist, looking at his hand, remembered that he really had never undergone an official evaluation. She explained that if they had done a proper assessment, the Shield Guild wouldn't have acted so hastily, causing all that confusion, and that reminded him of when he had to deal with the command leader, as well as the guild's vice leader, all because of a miscalculated misunderstanding. The hero gave a small smile, thinking that now things might settle down. Rubbing his head, he asked if the evaluation could be done right away. The lieutenant informed him that they were waiting for the host of the day. While the protagonist was wondering who that might be, the white-haired boy got excited again. After a moment, cat ears could be seen and someone was talking loudly, pointing at a camera. The girl with a makeshift camera and a white cat was a local influencer. The lieutenant said that it was that girl, and both young men looked in her direction. The girl with cat ears arrived cheerfully, bringing entertainment to the place. Excitedly, she said it was a pleasure to meet and introduced herself as Yui, and she immediately extended her hand to greet the hero. He returned the courtesy, introducing himself formally and shaking her hand. She, however, seemed overly enthusiastic, shaking his arm multiple times. Still holding the hero's hand, she said that not only was it the hand of a savior, it was beautiful. Visibly uncomfortable, the The protagonist just wanted the evaluation to begin. Jumping with joy, the girl said they could start as soon as possible. She wasted no time and began a live stream, speaking to her followers while pointing at the hero. She also mentioned the white-haired young man, who became incredibly excited. Kim Ki-bong felt great relief when they finally began walking toward the evaluation site. The young player and influencer missed no moment. Even while recording everything, she made a surprised face when she saw all the technology. Lifting the equipment and her hands up, she said the place looked completely different. She looked at the machinery because it was completely different from when she took the test. The lieutenant explained that they couldn't conduct a proper evaluation with the old equipment. That's why they developed new and improved machines, she said while adjusting a few. While pulling a lever, she said they would first measure strength. It was a simple device to operate. But the young influencer jumped in front and wanted to measure her levels first. So the lieutenant explained the correct way to perform the test. Already knowing how it worked, the young woman gripped the device with all her strength. She thought she couldn't squeeze any harder than she already was. Even so, she tried her best until the veins on her hand were bulging. As a result, the machine began to glow and make noise. She became visibly nervous because her followers were watching, and she was afraid of disappointing them. To calm her down, the lieutenant said the results were already in and she could release the device. Exhausted from exerting so much force, she figured the results should be high, but the test had been fun. The officer informed her that she was still ranked the same as in the first test. Very pleased, the influencer shared the news with her followers, even showing off her muscles. That act left the white-haired young man impressed. He stared at the pointy-eared girl for a moment. The officer told the hero he could squeeze as hard as he could for an accurate result. He looked at her skeptically and asked if she was sure about that. The lieutenant, in turn, assured him the equipment wouldn't break, but her expression changed when she saw that with the slightest force from the hero, the machine shattered, and one after another, the devices used to measure his strength kept breaking. This shocked not only the lieutenant and the influencer, but also left the white-haired young man speechless. The officer was embarrassed because the equipment she guaranteed wouldn't break ended up breaking. The hero tried to calm the officer as she grew disheartened. Meanwhile, the young influencer kept recording while Kang thought he hadn't had the chance to take the test. Even so, there was another large machine, but it too couldn't withstand a simple physical strike. Like the others, it broke, and the crystal ball used to measure magic power also couldn't handle it. Once again, all three were left stunned, and now even the officer stood there with her mouth open. With tears in his eyes, the white-haired young man was upset because he should have tested himself earlier. The hero was already feeling embarrassed and apologized for all the damage. While the officer was visibly discouraged, the influencer tried to steer the situation in a new direction. When the protagonist heard her say there would be an interview, his expression was anything but cheerful, especially when he looked at all the equipment and cameras pointed at him. The three of them were seated near the influencer, but the hero was visibly uncomfortable. The cheerful girl said she'd first like all three of them to introduce themselves to her audience. When Kang heard her say she had about 100,000 followers, he looked around to see where they were. Leaving the protagonist embarrassed, the young man looked around wildly, even near the cameras. Once again, he had to be restrained by the hero, who grabbed him to prevent further chaos. The protagonist returned the wild young man to his seat. The influencer seemed amused by the interaction between the two. She even asked the hero if it was a prank or if the young man was always that energetic. Embarrassed once again, the protagonist admitted that yes, the young man was really like that. And when the excitable young man tried to ask a question, the hero reprimanded him with a gesture, asking him to stay quiet. Thinking he had things under control, he sat down. Once again, the influencer asked him to introduce himself to everyone. Trying to be quick and get it over with, he introduced himself as the captain of the management team. And when he was about to say his age, he paused for a moment to remember his actual age. A bit embarrassed, he revealed that he was 30 years old. The influencer commented that she thought he was younger, while the white-haired young man said that wasn't true, that he was way older than that. The influencer then crafted her question and asked how he had become so strong. While he was still thinking about the first question, she already wanted to know the next one, why he worked for the government. After asking both questions, she simply stared, waiting to hear what he'd say. At that moment, the officer lowered her head with a sad expression because she knew the real story. She looked at the protagonist and knew it was purely out of revenge for everything that had happened to his family. The memories came rushing back to him, the day his mother was injured, and how he had watched her gradually weaken in his arms, until recently when she was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. That's why he answered it was because of his family. The officer kept observing him as he told the story she already knew, and the protagonist, holding the microphone, slowly began recounting what had happened. His sad story seemed to be drawing the attention of the cameras and the backstage crew. After he finished speaking, he looked in the direction of the influencer. She was sitting in a chair and appeared to be in tears. He didn't know why she was crying. The young woman just sat there with those large, tear-filled eyes. Because of her reaction, all the cameras pointed at her and the crew grew concerned. The officer looked over and heard them whispering that she had also been through something. With that, she closed her eyes, imagining the young woman might have gone through something very sad. Meanwhile, the girl cried with her cat on her shoulder. She had lost someone she loved to the monsters. At the same time as the interview, at a certain house, her family was gathered. They had watched the interview, and while eating something, they thought she always went too far. Her mother, watching the news, thought, "There she goes again," saying she lost her parents, while the mother slapped her chest, saying that both she and the father were very much alive. But the father didn't care. He just wanted his daughter to be happy doing what she loved. After crying a lot, the girl began to wipe her tears. She was doing the best she could. After the recording ended, the young woman thanked the hero for participating, while Kang made a frustrated face since he hadn't been able to say anything again. The protagonist wanted to make sure it was over for now and that there would be no more filming, but the officer told him she wasn't the one who had planned the schedule. Telling the influencer, she said that any discussion about the schedule should be with her. The protagonist looked at that girl and stated that if the tasks were over, he wouldn't want to do it again. He'd rather deal with dungeons than waste his time on that kind of thing. Even so, the officer asked him to calm down and said the next activity could be very helpful for him. He fixed his gaze on the officer and asked if she was sure about that. She nodded, trying to encourage him to engage in the next activity. She remembered when she had promised to help him with his revenge. She had said, under the rain, that she would help with the dungeons and the monsters, that she would help him with everything. She remembered having told him that he should trust her and follow her. The protagonist, however, thought those words from the young lieutenant were just recruiting lines. She, looking at him, knew he believed her words were hollow, meant only to persuade. That's why she looked him in the eye and said she had worked hard to fulfill what she had promised. Smiling, she said she was doing her best to achieve their shared goal. That made the protagonist want to know more about the subject. He asked her to give details about the next task. As they talked, they passed through a restricted and highly secured area. It looked like they were heading to another place with more advanced equipment. Meanwhile, the young man was amazed and looked around excitedly. There were many researchers working there, and they could see their research from a distance. Those researchers seemed highly engaged in their duties. Meanwhile, the lieutenant, and also a researcher, asked him to follow her. With his usual energy, Kang seemed very involved in everything. The lieutenant explained that there were many related aspects they still didn't have answers for. Meanwhile, the white-haired boy scratched his head because he didn't understand what they were talking about. The officer said that to understand a certain phenomenon properly, they needed to understand the energy. Those words seemed to make sense to the protagonist. She explained that they had been researching where dungeon energy came from. She said that if one could control the energy, they could very likely control a dungeon. For the first time, the protagonist seemed excited to hear they might be able to control dungeons, but the officer shook her head and said they hadn't reached that point yet. She showed him an energy core and asked him to take a look. He turned and looked at it, thinking about how familiar it seemed, and his system informed him it was a fragment of a sunstone. So he murmured that it was a sunstone. With a frown, the officer-researcher was intrigued as to how he already knew about them. Now the officer was satisfied, and speaking to the influencer, she said there was a great chance regarding the dungeons, that the two of them would explore and might have a daystone. The young man wanted to know how they had found that out. He was surprised because he had only come across one throughout all the dungeons he had visited. The lieutenant and researcher explained that it was thanks to the remains of the fire dragon. She said it worked like a compass and was capable of making predictions within a certain range. Showing a core, she said she believed the Daystone could be an item that might help with dungeon control. Even knowing it was for the greater good, the protagonist didn't feel comfortable going with that lady. When the lieutenant was asked if the hero couldn't go alone, she explained the dungeon's condition. She said it would only activate if 3 A-rank players entered together. She added that she couldn't summon A-rank players unless there was an emergency. Even so, the protagonist wanted to know if that young woman was trustworthy enough to go with him. The officer confidently nodded yes. Then she said that the third member of that mission had strong ties with the Prime Minister. While they were talking, the officer's phone rang, and she had to pull it from her lab coat. She looked and saw it was Miss Yu calling her. The protagonist didn't feel comfortable at all, while the white-haired young man was nearly falling asleep. Showing her phone, the officer winked at the protagonist and said it would be better if they all went out and talked together. They were already in a different setting. Kim walked alongside the white-haired young man who was throwing a fit. He wanted to go, but the protagonist looked to the side and told him he couldn't. Kang even started to cry, asking why he wasn't allowed to go. The protagonist asked him to look closely. On the dungeon, it said access was limited to 3 people. The young man calmed down a bit after reading it, while the protagonist explained about the 3 participants. He said it was only 3 people at once and even pointed to the number on the front of the dungeon. Even so, the white-haired young man still wanted to go. He wanted it to be just the 2 of them. And when he asked about the 3rd person on the mission, A noise caught both of their attention and the young man turned. It was a car speeding in, kicking up a cloud of dust and startling the two of them. The vehicle was large and loud, and the person driving seemed quite skilled. It stopped close to the two of them, surrounding them in a cloud of dust. The door opened slowly, and out stepped the young influencer. She seemed to be in constant live streams and said that soon she'd be going on a romantic date. The protagonist waved to the girl and said he needed to maintain the partnership with her. The young man still wondered if there was an open spot when he saw another pair of legs stepping down from the truck. The protagonist continued pointing and said now there were 3. This made the young man sad. Every time the hero saw that flashy girl, he seemed to get extremely uncomfortable. While the girl waved her hands trying to get the hero's attention, Kang was clearly upset. The silhouette of the 4 people could be seen talking and greeting each other. The third member extended his hand to the protagonist. The man introduced himself formally while Kang remained demotivated. Kim Ki-bong accepted the man's handshake and introduced himself as well. That red-haired man standing before the protagonist was the master of the Hwoarang Guild, Chien Yubin. He was also one of the first to awaken 10 years ago. When the dungeon first appeared, according to the Prime Minister, he was one of those who fought. He became one of the heroes who protected the country. Now he stood there before the protagonist, extending his hand in greeting. The hero simply observed the man, thinking he was the third member of the team. So Kim Ki-bong accepted the handshake and said he was the captain. He was in charge of managing special dungeons, and from that point on would be under Chien Yubin's support. While the two of them talked in the background, the young influencer continued her live stream, explaining they were about to enter a dungeon. The girl said the dungeon allowed 3 participants and that she would be going in with Ki-bong and Yubin. Pointing to the protagonist, she made him completely uncomfortable by calling him the hero. She aimed the camera straight at his face and talked about the specific dungeon. She explained that the dungeon was famous for being rated 6-star in difficulty. Pointing at the two, she embarrassed them and said it was the first time a 3-person team would enter there. She emphasized that, considering who the 2 participants were, she didn't see any problem. With a sad expression, she explained that, as everyone knew, the live stream couldn't continue inside the dungeon. Waving goodbye and winking, she ended the broadcast. Even the young woman's face looked relieved after finishing that task. Returning to her true self, she raised her arms and greeted the two. She asked if they had already received the mission details from the lieutenant. The protagonist, as always uncomfortable, kept a strange expression. For a moment, he seemed to be thinking about something. The Sunstone. As the lieutenant had said, she trusted both of them, but she wanted him to recover it on his own. Even though she trusted them, she didn't want anyone else laying a hand on the stone. The hero thought it was best to recover it alone, but in any case, since he had to bring them along, it might as well be quick. The protagonist pointed to the entrance and asked if the two could go in already. The girl, super excited, said yes, while the white-haired young man remained with his head down. He looked at them as they left, with a sad face and tears falling from his eyes. When the protagonist called for Kang Wei, he looked up but still seemed downhearted. The hero's request was for the young man to return to headquarters and assist the vice captain. Even though it was a task he would have liked to fulfill at another time, now he was too upset to feel happy. Nevertheless, the 3 walked toward the dungeon entrance, while the young man went in the opposite direction. They were about to cross the dungeon's entry limit. As they did, a light was emitted. The wind lifted the girl's jacket, making the outfit puff up. Even though all 3 had been through this before, each one reacted differently. After the intense light, it looked like something had scorched the ground. The brightness faintly revealed the silhouettes of the 3. They were being transported into the dungeon. The system alerted that the player had entered the dungeon called Moth Chamber. Now the protagonist looked at his 2 teammates and declared that the official incursion was beginning. The 2 were startled by the girl's reaction. She seemed to have noticed something no one else had. She was ready to restart her recordings under the premise that something unprecedented could happen. The red-haired man thought that girl really was a professional streamer. The forest, though empty and silent, had a strange atmosphere. Up ahead walked the protagonist, while the girl skipped between the 2 of them. She looked back because Chien Yubin found something strange. Trying to sound calm, the girl asked what he was talking about. The man revealed that they had been inside the dungeon for quite a while, and no monsters had appeared. The girl, with a relieved expression, said it was good no monsters had shown up. The man insisted that wasn't what he meant. He was referring to the overall pattern. He stated that normally many flying monsters would appear early on, but there weren't any here. Waving her hand to ease the mood, the girl said there was nothing wrong with feeling happy. She also added that besides, they had the hero who cleared an 8-star dungeon, pointing to the protagonist. The man admitted that the girl had a point and also admired the hero. They continued walking, the girl cheerful and satisfied, while the 2 men remained cautious. Even after walking for a long time, the atmosphere didn't change. It remained calm, but something strange lingered in the air. The girl lit the area with her recording camera, ready for any change. The protagonist thought they had been there since morning, but it didn't feel like that much time had passed. The girl explained that the sun in the moth chamber set faster, and the night was darker. Qian Yubin said it usually took 3 days to clear a moth chamber on foot. The girl, thinking they had time, suggested using her magic to make a campfire. Throughout her antics, her camera remained perched on her shoulder, missing no angle. Using her magic, she created a good fire that warmed all 3 of them, even her small white cat. The animal was already showing signs of sleepiness after running so long on the girl's shoulder. The girl said that the moth chamber took longer to clear than a regular dungeon. Even so, the hero looked up with a suspicious expression. He thought that, just as Yu had said, he could see the sky darkening intensely. As they stood there, they noticed that the sky was unlike a normal one. No stars, no moon, just emptiness. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, a pile of documents was building up on the vice captain's desk. He was trying to handle all the paperwork, hoping that no dungeon would require the team's help. But the worst happened, and the dungeon alarm was triggered, putting him on high alert. One of the team members arrived in a hurry, reporting that an unexpected dungeon had broken open. It was located in Gyeonggi province, and the vice captain stood up immediately, extremely worried. He thought this was the worst time for something like that to happen, because the captain wasn't with them. The subordinate asked what they should do, since they were now without leadership. The man was sweating, reflecting that without the hero, they didn't represent much strength. They were used to living in the captain's shadow, and without him, they always performed poorly. Now standing before the subordinate, the vice captain felt incapable of making a quick decision. However, the subordinate suggested gathering all the team members, even if they were weak soldiers, because they had to protect the nation. With that, the vice captain clenched his fist, changing his expression. But an idea crossed his mind, making his eyes widen. He asked for all team members to be summoned, which made the subordinate uneasy. Trying to calm him, the vice captain said it was just a speculation, but they had to hold on to hope. Meanwhile, the white-haired young man was sleeping in the dormitory. He had cried so much that his face was red, because he wished he had gone along with the hero. The scene shifted back to the dungeon, where the 3 were gathered around the campfire, eating and drinking something warm. Meanwhile, at headquarters, the vice captain was gathering the courage to make a difficult decision. He was finally in front of the room where the white-haired young man was staying. Even with trembling hands, he gathered all his willpower to open the door. As soon as he entered, he noticed the young man was sulking and turned toward the corner of the room. The young man noticed the presence as soon as the door opened, but didn't ask the reason for the visit. Upon seeing that it was the vice captain accompanied by other soldiers, he simply sat on the bed and observed. The vice captain remembered the time he had argued with the young man and underestimated his strength. He was well aware of how he had nearly been defeated by the boy's fist. The memories made him uncomfortable, and he sweated in silence, but clenched his fist, knowing he couldn't back down. For the sake of the nation, he had to call him, no matter what. Looking at the young man, he didn't know how to address him, whether to call him a rookie or something else. It was evident that the boy was far too strong to be treated like a beginner, and he recalled the fight between him and the captain. He knew that any wrong choice of words could irritate him, and with the captain absent, things could spiral out of control. While he was thinking about how to deal with the young man, one of the subordinates directly called him a rookie. That made the vice captain look at him strangely, expecting an immediate reaction. However, the white-haired young man didn't seem to care, despite the strength he had shown. The subordinate informed him that there was an urgent task and asked if he hadn't heard the siren. The young man replied that he didn't want to do anything, because without Kim Ki-bong, he had no motivation. The vice captain knew that dealing with a dungeon rupture was a race against time. If he couldn't convince the boy to join them, the consequences could be disastrous. So with effort, he also called him a rookie, and trying to sound upbeat, said maybe the captain would praise him if he helped. The subordinate whispered to the vice captain, thinking the boy wouldn't fall for such a simple line. However, the boy thought he could later tell Kim Ki-bong that he had solved everything on his own. He imagined the praise he might receive and even dreamed that the hero would hug him and recognize his effort. He even wanted to be patted on the head as a reward for a job well done. With that thought, he sat back on the bed, still with his back turned to the others. Soon after, the vice captain and the subordinate heard a loud shout confirming that he would accept the mission. Surprised, they couldn't believe such an immediate response. With teary eyes, the boy asked if it was true that the captain would praise him. He said that if so, he wanted them to show him the way, although he was already running ahead. The vice captain commented that even while asking for directions, the boy was already taking the lead. Now he could be seen walking backward, smiling and humming like before. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the atmosphere was different, foggy and tense, as the 3 moved forward cautiously. The protagonist asked the system to locate the presence of monsters. After some time, the system confirmed that there were no monsters within a 3-kilometer radius. This information struck the protagonist as odd, and he recalled the words of his companions. Yu drew the others' attention by saying something felt wrong. There were no monsters nearby. The hero confirmed that he already knew about the absence of monsters within the specified range. Qian Yubin wanted to know how he could be so sure. To avoid explaining, the protagonist simply said he just knew. That made the man admire him even more, since an SS class player was already strong, but this one was something else entirely. The young woman suggested they speed up, because it felt like a race to the top. Without waiting, she ran ahead. Yubin, not wanting to fall behind, also started running, leaving the protagonist annoyed. He thought that, if he kept going at that pace, he would never complete his mission. His mission was to recover the Daystone, nothing more. To do that, he activated his special suit, which began to transform, emitting light. The light was so intense it caught the attention of the two accompanying him. They only saw a flash moving at high speed. It was a blinding light, and the wind it generated signaled the protagonist's presence. You thought that man was magical, but she didn't understand the nature of his powers since he didn't use magic. Yubin also wondered what kind of power it was, if not magic. The hero didn't like wasting time, so he went straight to investigate the area. Stopping at a rocky point, he asked the system to locate the Daystone. The system began scanning, checking several areas until it completed the search. A signal of light appeared, indicating the direction of the objective. He just had to follow that path to find the Daystone. After landing, only the glow of his arrival could be seen in the rocky area. The protagonist had white hair, a common trait when using his maximum power. The system informed him he had reached the destination and navigation would end. He found it strange and stopped in front of the stone, which seemed to rest on a pedestal made precisely for it. Taking the first step, he triggered some sort of trap. Black and violet lights took over the surroundings, bringing forth various monsters. The system detected a massive number of monsters being generated. Now the hero was surrounded by over 100 flying creatures. They were strange beings with teeth in unusual places. Those were smaller moths that protected the boss's nest. The protagonist looked at them as if they weren't much of a threat. From afar, a cloud of dust and tremors drew attention. Yu wanted to know what was going on, but her companion also didn't have an answer. Both ran in the same direction, worried, as the sun was about to set. The young woman said that at that speed, they wouldn't make it in time, but she had an idea. She said it was something extreme, but possible, since there were no monsters in the area. With that, she created a pink elastic shield that wrapped around her companion. Manipulating magic with her hands, she apologized, saying it was the only viable solution. Inside the elastic bubble, the two began to run. Gaining momentum, the young woman cast a powerful fire spell. The explosion launched them upward, almost reaching the top. After landing, protected by the bubble, they managed to stabilize the magic. They were surprised to see the protagonist already surrounded by many defeated monsters. They were still inside the bubble and believed barely 5 minutes had passed. They had run as fast as they could to the top, but that man had already dealt with everything. He had done it all alone in a minimal amount of time, and his appearance was different. The hero was now standing before the Daystone. The stone emitted a strong signal in shades of black and violet. After a different kind of landing, Yu brushed the dust off her knee. Standing up, she asked the protagonist if he was okay. What was left of the moths was scattered across the ground. The hero, hearing the girl worry about him, told her he was fine. He said they should continue from that point onward. The three walked among the remains of the monsters the hero had taken down. As the protagonist stepped on the ground, a strange energy began to spread. Yu, full of curiosity, wanted to know what it was. It was a tangible energy, and when she stretched out her arm, she could touch it with her hand. However, she felt something like a shock coming from what seemed to be a crack. Blowing on her hand, she told the others she had never seen anything like it. Yubin admitted it was also his first time seeing something so bizarre. She asked the two to step back for now, as she would try to destroy it. With that, she prepared a wind spell between her hands. A closed fist solved everything. The hero simply brushed lightly against that layer, and with a simple touch, cracked the sphere. A massive explosion of earth could be seen from above. The three stood before the Daystone, which lay on an altar, and now that the barrier had been damaged, it could easily be reached. The protagonist turned his head and asked everyone to move forward. The girl, a bit uneasy from finding the protagonist strange, replied yes, and the three once again set off through the fallen monsters. Now the protagonist stood before the Daystone, along with the other two. The system asked the hero if he wanted to absorb the Daystone, and he coldly replied no. Once again, the system tried to confirm whether the player really didn't want to absorb the stone. He simply ignored the system and reached out his hand to take it. He was just a few centimeters away from touching the black sphere. When he finally touched it, he felt something was happening. Before fully grabbing it, he noticed an emanation coming from it in shades of black and violet. Curious, he wanted to know what was going on. A powerful energy overwhelmed the three of them, and none of them knew what it was or where it came from. It felt like a darkness was hovering around the three of them. In an instant, the three were consumed by that wave of black and violet energy. Far from there, the scene was different. The sky was blue, and a helicopter flew overhead. All military forces, both air and ground, were mobilizing to reach the dungeon. A strong system was set up so that the soldiers could carry out their duty. Many were already preparing when someone called for the lieutenant colonel. That tall, white-haired man turned with a strange look. He quickly realized they were members of Kim Ki-bong's group. While the lieutenant colonel took out a tobacco stick, the vice captain asked about the situation. The old war veteran looked at the vice leader, who commented that he was sure all the dungeons had already been cleared. The officer replied that he wasn't sure either, but had received reports about a dungeon with strange behavior. The vice captain had also seen that report and knew it was only predictions, but they could be wrong. He thought it might have been a coding error, but now that he was there, he found it unlikely. The old war dog asked where their captain was and why they had come alone. The vice captain, slightly intimidated, said the captain was on another mission under orders from the prime minister. The man discarded the tobacco and threw it on the ground, saying that was terrible news. That old marine wanted to have enough ammunition since they couldn't count on the captain's talent. Then the vice captain told the lieutenant colonel that they had something, a trump card. The man wanted to know what it was, as citizens' lives depended on it. The vice captain knew that and risked his position by claiming the rookie could handle it. Even scared, he stood by what he had said. That made the old war dog uneasy. Still, he wanted the vice captain to go ahead with the plan. Very satisfied with having received permission, the vice captain saluted and took his leave. He believed that among the few people in the country who could replace the captain, the only one he personally knew and believed in was precisely that young man, the one who used to annoy the guards with his excessive energy and electricity. Back in the dungeon scene, after being consumed by the energy, each of them was now in a different place. The young influencer was unconscious on the ground. When she suddenly opened her eyes, she was startled because she didn't know where she was. She quickly sat up, looked around, and couldn't tell where her companions had gone. Every direction she looked, there were only rocks and darkness, and she had no idea a place like that existed inside the moth chamber. Now standing, she remembered having cleared several moth chambers before. In none of them had she found a cave within another cave. She imagined it could be due to the daystone and that strange energy. Either way, she was alone and looked in every direction, trying to find one of her companions. Elsewhere, the protagonist activated night vision. He stood holding the stone, also alone and far from the others. He asked the system where he was, and the system informed him it was an unranked and unnamed dungeon. To the hero, that was strange, and he didn't know why he had been taken to that place. The system suggested it might be because of the daystone, but couldn't be sure. It stated that if he absorbed it, he might learn more, but the protagonist refused. He was annoyed by the system's insistence. He was more concerned with recovering the daystone, and because of that, he hadn't paid enough attention to react when they were suddenly teleported, which was now a big problem. All he could do was deal with the current situation and get out of that place as soon as possible. He felt like he was being watched by someone, sensing an energy coming from behind. He turned his head to check what it was, identified the source, and was already preparing to face it. In another part of the dungeon, the young woman kept trying to film and light her way with the camera. She asked as if there were viewers listening where she might be. She commented that she was scared and that this was bad. As before, she hadn't found any monsters. She had spent a lot of her mana, as she had used it several times for flame effects and spells. Now she was practically out of mana, and knew it would take a while to recover. She was thinking about that when she heard a noise, making her heart race. Her big round eyes quickly widened. She was surrounded by 3 horrifying monsters, strong and with a repulsive appearance. They were savage beasts, with underdeveloped brains bulging out of their skulls. She realized they were wolves, and now she was alone among them. The third member of the group was also alone and surrounded by wolves. Yuban found himself in the same situation, surrounded by several of those beasts. He didn't think it was normal. No chamber of the moth should contain moth-type monsters. However, he was surrounded by creatures of another species. Now he had to deal with them, so he placed his hands on his weapons. He was a specialist in that type of armament. Yuban had a bad feeling, thinking something wrong was happening there. Elsewhere in the moth chamber, the wolves tried to corner the protagonist. Unfazed, he looked at those beasts, which to him were nothing more than puppies. Though disgusting and repulsive, the protagonist saw them as cute dogs. Meanwhile, in the city, Kang Hui and Captain Kim Ki-bong's team were facing a rift. But in the dungeon where the 3 heroes were, the young woman was still cornered by those wolves. She thought to herself that she had to stay calm, as this could be a tough situation. She remembered she had a mana reserve stored in her heart-shaped necklace. With that, she activated it and used her inventory, as she was a rank A hunter. More than that, she was recognized by an entire nation, and she wouldn't give up just because of the sight of those wolves. Even if one of them had its mouth wide open toward the protagonist, he simply punched one after another, not caring about how ugly they were. The more he attacked, the more of those disgusting wolves came at him. Now several of them were splattered across the ground while he leaped. He dodged others trying to devour him. After leaping upward, he came down with both feet on one of the wolves' faces, delivering it a miserable end, then looked at a part of the wolf that seemed to still be holding on. With no expression, he just stared at the monster before eliminating it completely. Sending one of those horrid monsters flying, he caught a horrible stench. He thought those bizarre dogs were stronger than he had expected. Even so, to him it wasn't a big deal. but he was worried about the other two teammates. With this concern, he asked the system to locate the other two. With that, the system began the search, completed it, and opened a map for the protagonist to see. Their locations were far from him, and they were also in separate places. In another dungeon, twisting and turning as best he could, was Qian Yubin. Even with great skill, using his strength and daggers, he was already getting tired. He thought it had been a long time since he'd encountered enemies in such a dark place. That made it a bit difficult to locate the monsters in that cave, but he knew that every one of the original players still alive today would manage it. When those monsters came at him, he thought that to survive, he had to fight hard, and after surviving over 10 years fighting monsters, he wasn't about to surrender to a few now. The more he fought, the more of those wolf-like monsters appeared in front of him. Despite his agility, dagger skill, and extreme speed, he was getting tired. At some point, they were practically all defeated, and he, with a gesture proving his skill, efficiently sheathed his daggers. A thought crossed his mind. He didn't know about Captain Kim, but he was sure the man could handle himself. The problem was the girl. He was really worried about that young lady. He knew she was the type who used magic and had spent a lot of mana together with him earlier. It was certain that a sorceress without mana was perfect prey for monsters. That's why that player knew he had to get out of that cave as quickly as possible to reach the young lady. And in the cave where she was managing the situation as best she could. She had already used several items from her inventory and was protecting herself. With the little mana she had left, she created a field that could block those monsters from entering. However, she still didn't know exactly what to do, since she couldn't use a magic attack at that moment. If she had enough mana, she could easily focus on both defense and offense. But her MP was extremely low, and she felt she shouldn't take any big risks. She knew that Captain Kibong and Yubin should show up at any moment to rescue her. But even so, she had to conserve enough mana before it ran out. That was when she looked toward the camera, which was still recording on her shoulder. Touching the camera, she thought she couldn't let her fans witness her defeat, so she decided to take a little more risk and show that she was one of the survivors. She knew that victory was never guaranteed when humans fought against monsters. That's why she slowly lowered the shield that had been protecting her from those monsters, now willing to take the risk. As soon as she completely deactivated the protective field, the monsters charged at her. As any proper streamer would, she had her staff and filming equipment at the ready. To avoid missing a single moment, she quickly cast a fire explosion spell. That magic consumed mana, but it was useful and effective against that type of monster. She was also a skillful person, jumping from place to place without losing her energy or efficiency. She was among the top 100 in the rankings, and not for nothing. After positioning herself, she launched a lightning spell, hitting several of the nearby monsters. Now those monsters were nothing more than charred remains. Although the attack had been effective, her MP was now completely drained. She felt that, now being totally out of mana, she was starting to feel dizzy. She also had a throbbing wound on her arm and knew she should have avoided that attack altogether. Staggering, she hoped the other two were safe and doing well. However, what she hadn't noticed was that one of the monsters wasn't completely defeated. On the ground, it trembled, showing signs that there was still life in that monster. She felt it as it approached from behind her. When she turned around and saw the monster, she also saw daggers flying in that direction. It was just in time for a second group member to arrive and defend her. Now, seeing that she hadn't been hit, she was relieved to have been saved by Yubin. He was also satisfied, having been able to find her thanks to a large beam of light. Even though the two of them were still inside the cave, she took advantage of the calm moment to drink an elixir and recovered some of her MP. After consuming the drink, she gave thanks, finally feeling alive again. Even though her MP had improved a bit, it was still below 1/3. She told her partner that the cave felt strange, and those symptoms, they only appeared in monsters that were infected by moths, and the man seemed to agree, looking upward. The two of them were startled. It was a strange sound that made them both uneasy. Yubin told the young woman that they needed to hurry and get out of there as soon as possible. He believed it could be another dungeon, and if it was, they were close to the boss. She thought there was only one way for it all to end, and that was to find and confront the boss directly. And the two of them began to run at high speed, heading toward a light they could see. Suddenly, the man stopped, and she asked why he wasn't running anymore. He grabbed her arm so that she would stop too. She hadn't noticed what he had seen, so he motioned with his finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet, and pointed in the direction he wanted her to look. Goblins from behind a rock were watching the girl, who stood there in shock. The fright was so intense that she brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide open. The two of them were now seeing monsters completely different from usual. Yu had to control herself not to scream because what stood in front of her was terrifying. She had seen countless monsters up to that point, but none were like those. The monsters ahead of them were different and vaguely resembled humans. However, they only looked human on the outside. These were like half-humans. She and Yubin thought he had never seen monsters as unpleasant and disgusting as those. They became even more frightened when they heard something strange. It seemed like the monsters could communicate, and they spoke to each other. They said they could smell humans nearby. When the players heard that the monsters could talk, their expressions turned even more fearful. They wondered if the monster had really just spoken. Yuben heard what it said, but it didn't sound like the language of that country. The monster was now scratching the ground with its claws and kept chattering. The two players could see the monster glancing around, searching for them. The girl, with a serious look, stared at the player in front of her, seeking a reaction. The man grew serious too, and the two of them seemed to communicate just with a glance. Every minute in that place was becoming extremely dangerous. They both widened their eyes when they realized they had been spotted. The monster had found where the humans were. Yuben had no intention of starting a fight, especially since he was very tired. The young woman didn't want to fight either, since her mana was extremely low, but the monster wanted to fight and launched an attack. The two of them dodged quickly. They both had extreme flexibility and agility, which allowed them to evade the attack. Yuben, who was very skilled with his daggers, quickly prepared to grab them. The young woman also began forming a magic circle in her hand to search her inventory for something to fight with. Now that player was ready. It wasn't what he wanted, but he had to face that monster. The enemy was terrifying and vanished into a cloud of dust, revealing only its silhouette. Yuben noticed that the monster in front of him was extremely fast. The monster, realizing it was superior to humans, burst into laughter. Meanwhile, they assessed that monster. It was full of scars that looked like surgical stitches. Even with minimal analysis, much was already clear. That body wasn't a genuine monster's body. It was something artificial. Yuben asked his companion how much mana she had left. Seeing that her partner needed help, she said she could cast no more than 4 or 5 spells. Even so, she stated that this would be more than enough. Intending to finish it quickly, the man launched himself toward the monster. The creature only stared intensely, its mouth full of rows of teeth aimed at the human. As the player flew toward it, mid-air, with his daggers drawn, his eyes were burning red with fury, declaring he would eliminate the monster. When his dagger struck the monster, he realized how extremely rigid it was. The monster simply looked at the human and began mocking him. It wanted to know what exactly he was trying to do. Now that player found himself in a delicate position. His daggers couldn't pierce it, and he was vulnerable. If he didn't dodge quickly, he could easily be caught. The player's luck was that his partner was there and immediately cast a spell that held one of the monster's limbs. Thanks to that, the man managed to pull his dagger free. Even though it was a shallow strike, it had gotten stuck. After that, he retreated with increasing agility away from that terrifying being. He looked at the girl and thanked her, since he had nearly seen death right in front of him. Meanwhile, the man thought there was something off. Those were half monsters, half humans, and the worst part was, he wasn't alone. There were 2 more who seemed to be engaged in a strange conversation. He thought that if those 2 joined the fight, both he and his partner would be in serious trouble. So he called the young lady. He had something to ask of her. Moving behind her, he confirmed if she could buff him with the remaining mana. Prepared with her staff, she granted him acceleration, flame sword, and strength. Now his attributes were at their peak. The buff she gave him would last for some time. Now the player felt energized, as if his entire body was overflowing with power. He could feel his leg muscles intensifying, and that strength coursed through his whole body, giving him extreme agility. The monster found it strange that suddenly, the man had become much faster. Now the two were fighting on equal footing, even managing to land damage on the monster. Qian Yuben's speed had reached absurd levels, and with that, he was dealing significant damage to the monster. This made the female player very satisfied, knowing the man was now surpassing the monster. She knew that normally he wouldn't be able to cut through the monster's hide, but this was possible thanks to the buff. However, Qian Yuben started to have doubts, especially when he saw how similar those monsters were to humans. He had cut down countless monsters until that day and had never seen one bleed red. That deeply disturbed him. Having noticed that bizarre event, he began to wonder, was he really fighting a monster? But that wasn't the time or place for doubts. Despite the buff, he was still very tired from the previous battle in the cave against the wolves. The girl, seeing what was happening, thought she couldn't ask out loud if they had won. She thought maybe they had. However, she called out to her partner upon noticing something off. Qian Yuben had noticed it too. They had caught the attention of the other 2 monsters, and now they realized the mess they were in. Both of them were extremely tired, and now they would have to fight 2 enraged monsters at once. These monsters tried to attack the player simultaneously. They spoke to each other, saying the man was fast at running away. They thought the man was nothing but a little rat protecting that insignificant human woman. And once again, the man asked the young lady a question. He wanted to know how much mana she had left. She said she had used it all on the buffs she had given him, so she would only be able to cast simple spells. Yuben thought it was the worst possible time for the monsters to have noticed them. Gripping the handle of one of her daggers tightly, she thought she had to finish off those 2 monsters quickly, before the rest of the buff she had received wore off. With that, she charged in their direction. Elsewhere, smashing everything in his path, including walls, was the protagonist, who was now alerted. The system informed him that another battle was underway inside a dungeon. On the map, the indicators pointed to his 2 companions, who were far away from him. Immediately, the protagonist asked the system how long it would take to reach them. After evaluating, it reported that it would take 30 minutes if he took the shortest route on foot. The protagonist thought that was too far. The system explained that it was due to the structure of the cave. Hearing the system, the protagonist had an idea. He didn't need to fly. He could simply go through. To do that, he prepared himself to once again transform into that incredibly strong white-haired man, and all that could be seen of him was a light piercing through several of the dungeon's walls. He feared he wouldn't arrive in time to save his two companions, and he was right to think that because in the fight, Yuben was taking the worst of it. His body was no longer as fast and agile as before. His strikes were also no longer as powerful. Exhaustion was evident on his face. No matter how much the young woman tried to help, she was also low on mana, not even having enough to assist with small spells. All that could be seen now were the silhouettes of the two monsters facing off against the two players. The system alerted the protagonist that he had already entered the range of the battle area. Even though he was moving at incredible speed, there was still a full minute left before he could arrive. And in the fight, Yuben was holding out as best he could. His movements had already slowed, and his speed had decreased. Still, he tried to make the most of the final moments of the buff, because he knew that once it wore off, he wouldn't be able to add any depth to his attacks. Even he no longer had much conviction in his strikes, knowing they were already flawed. Still, he had no choice but to keep fighting. And at a certain moment, his strength failed and his defense weakened. Seeing that happen, you had to take quick action. The player also realized that danger was approaching and that he had no chance or time to react. That's when the young woman used her magic to cast a spell. She used Split, and with it hit the second monster that was about to attack Yuben from behind. Seeing that opportunity, he took the chance to pull back slightly. He got closer to the young lady. Both were now exhausted and at their limits. Yu said it reminded her of the good old days. Yuben replied that if they wanted to talk freely, they'd better deal with those two monsters first. Although the monsters had minor injuries, they were still at full strength. One of the monsters said those humans were stronger than any they had encountered before. It also warned that none of the humans had survived to tell the tale. The monster stated that after that thing had been transplanted into them, they were reborn, and now they were like immortal beings. They called themselves the new humans. Yuben had no idea what the monster was talking about, so he just stared in anger. The monster was about to show them the power it had spoken of, something overwhelming. One of them opened its mouth wide and began to suck in the monster that had been eliminated, and then continued absorbing the two monsters that had been defeated by the two players. Both the man and the young woman couldn't understand what was happening. Yu was stunned to see the monster absorbing the others. They wondered what kind of monster could that be, one capable of constantly transforming. Now the two of them stood before a super powerful monster, while both were on the verge of collapse. Yuben didn't even know exactly what was in front of him. It looked like a fusion of three parts, more like a robot. The girl had no idea what was going to happen since she was out of mana. Yuben, closing his eyes, also felt like he was completely out of strength. In front of him was a creature that now had 3 heads and 3 times the strength of a regular monster. For them, it was the worst possible scenario. Yuben stared at the creature, gritting his teeth as sweat poured down. Leaning on his dagger, he knew that fighting that thing was the same as fighting 3 of them. Yu heard Yuben call her again, and with that, she already knew what it was about. He said he knew he wasn't being reasonable, but he needed her to focus all the mana she had left, and use one last buff spell to enhance his abilities. He told her she only had enough mana left for a single spell, but instead of using it all at once, she would split it. She would give him 3 buffs, though each would be equivalent to only 1/3 of their normal power, and she cast the spell in his direction, increasing his acceleration and flame sword. The strength was slightly amplified. Now he could once again wield his daggers and hope to show that monster the strength of the first ones. When he said that, he was referring to those who had survived the first contact with monsters. And so he launched himself toward that monster. The young woman seemed to notice something, so she looked in a certain direction. What she was feeling were tremors, and they were getting stronger and stronger. She noticed they seemed to be coming from the cave wall, and it was about to break. With a false rupture, someone emerged. It was the protagonist. He seemed to be moving at 1,000 miles per hour, ready to defeat the monster. The girl simply watched as the 2 men were charging at the monster from different directions. Yuben seemed to notice something as he looked at that monster. The protagonist was very close to the monster without showing any sign of fear, and with a single punch, he shattered the monster, sending it flying through the air. The light was so intense it covered the area. The monster was now nothing but dust, and the 2 of them were seeing all of it unfold right before their eyes. Yuben and Yui knew the protagonist was strong, yet both of them widened their eyes in shock. Now, after the flash and all the dust, they saw the silhouette of someone approaching them. The protagonist, surrounded by dust, said it was a relief, and they immediately recognized his voice. The hero, still with his white hair, said he had barely made it in time to save them. Now the 3 of them stood near that strange monster. The hero was notified by the system that a daystone had been found, which seemed odd, since he already had one in his pocket. Still, the system wasn't malfunctioning. it was referring to another stone that carried unknown energy, one he had found after defeating those monsters. Meanwhile, the young woman admired the body and fragments that were still twitching from the monster. Yubin, seeing the monster still moving, told the girl he would finish it off, but the hero asked him to wait a moment, a request that made both of them uneasy. While they waited, the protagonist asked the system to absorb the energy. Even though it warned him that it was a small and impure energy, it was still possible to absorb it. As he began absorbing those fragments of impure energy, the monster started to deteriorate. The light was so intense that the two had to raise their arms to shield their eyes, but the protagonist remained calm, eyes closed, absorbing all that energy. Once the stone was successfully absorbed, he was able to unlock another function in the system. The hero noticed that the system was becoming increasingly expressive. After absorbing the energy, the other two players noticed the monster slowly fading away. The system notified the protagonist that it could sense the dungeon where the boss was located, and that's exactly what the girl said. They still hadn't found the boss, the Queen Moth. As the protagonist stood still, he heard the girl say they would have to destroy it to clear the dungeon. With that, he simply walked forward and then gave a light punch to the wall. That was enough to raise dust and scatter pieces of rock in all directions. After breaking through the wall, they found something, which once again made their companions uneasy. The protagonist didn't care. He just kept walking into the hole he had just created. Yubin told her they should follow the protagonist. So the two began running in the same direction the hero had gone. Reaching a certain place, they stopped, and once again, they were terrified. The image before them was horrifying. The great boss, Queen Moth, was trapped in a large pentagram. The system warned that it could sense the corrupted fragment of a daystone inside the dungeon's boss. The protagonist couldn't believe that the monster before him, at death's door, was the boss. The system stated that the monster was currently incapacitated and seemed to be asking to be put down. The protagonist found it strange, as he didn't know the system could read monsters' emotions. The system wasn't capable of reading their minds, but it could detect basic emotions. That monster was feeling fear alongside resignation, and that was new to the protagonist. He wanted to understand why that monster wanted so badly to be eliminated and what had happened to make it desire death. Of course, the protagonist wasn't the only one who found the situation strange. Their main target was the Queen Moth, who should have been in the Moth Chamber. However, she was in an unknown cave within a dungeon full of bizarre monsters. Until now, she hadn't even been identified, and on top of that, she was gravely wounded and trapped inside a massive magic circle. The suspicions of the rank A hunters turned into uncertainty as they observed that monster. Yu was the only one in the group who understood more about magic and was studying the formation of that magic circle. It was certain that she had already gone through several moth chambers during her career. She was absolutely sure that things there were completely abnormal. After analyzing the magic, she stated that it was a restriction magic circle, but not just anyone could activate it. Even more so, because it was such a large circle, it would require the skill of a rank A or possibly even a rank S hunter. Yubin found it all extremely bizarre and couldn't understand why the monster was opened up or why its organs had been taken. It was clear that those were not normal battle wounds. The cuts should have been rough and uneven, but in that monster's case, the cuts were incredibly precise and extremely clean. Upon examining the situation, Yubin realized that the organs and useful parts had been removed and the monster had been left to die. Yu had come to the same conclusion, and it was so horrifying to her that she bit her lip nervously. It was nothing less than an artificial dungeon, and now they stood before a great being in pain. Yubin's facial veins bulged with rage because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He ground his teeth, stating that it was obvious that experiments were being conducted on monsters. The protagonist thought the same thing, but it wasn't entirely unexpected for him. After all, he had witnessed similar research being conducted in his own country using the remains of the fire dragon. Now all the protagonist wanted was to escape that dungeon before something terrible happened. So he moved forward and entered the circle, approaching the Grand Moth Queen. He didn't look at her with hatred as he did with other monsters, but instead showed a ray of pity. He asked the system to absorb the fragments. He knew that by completing this, he would also end the suffering of the great monster trapped in the magic circle. Little by little, the system began absorbing that corrupted energy. You noticed that the same phenomenon from before was happening again, and she widened her eyes. Meanwhile, another participant kept a firm expression, knowing it was the same glowing fragment. The protagonist continued to absorb the energy in the middle of it all. The monster, before fading, seemed to say something, as if thanking them for being freed. Slowly, it disappeared into the intensity of the light, and the hero simply closed his eyes. After the system announced that the energy absorption from the Daystone was complete, the monster continued disintegrating until only dust remained, and after that, not even the dust was left, only the three of them remained inside that dungeon. Now the circle was breaking, allowing them to leave the dungeon. Even with everything over, Yubin was no longer the same. His feelings had changed since entering. The protagonist noticed this in his expression and knew he wanted answers and explanations. That's why he said he would explain everything. But first, they needed to leave the dungeon. Yu agreed that the protagonist was right, thinking it would be better to talk outside, and she pointed to the exit. Although he didn't like it, Yubin knew it was the right thing to do, and with a look, he decided to leave the conversation for later. He agreed to go and receive the explanations later. Thus, the three of them headed for the exit of the dungeon through that rupture. They now crossed the rupture one by one. Being the last, the girl hurried so she wouldn't be left behind. Little by little, the rupture of the artificial dungeon closed, leaving only the large magic circle behind. Outside, the system deactivated the night vision, and the protagonist felt a burning in his eyes. They had all grown accustomed to the dungeon's darkness, and now they were under the open sky again. However, they were not alone. They were surrounded by the armed forces. The team reported via radio that the three had been found and requested immediate contact with HQ. The protagonist just watched all the commotion and rush. Yu, startled, wanted to know what had happened while they were trapped inside the dungeon. A soldier approached and asked if the three of them were okay. Everyone looked toward the lieutenant, who showed deep concern. After some time, she had already explained the whole situation. They now knew that 2 months had passed. But to them, that was impossible, as a moth chamber took only 3 days to be cleared. Saddened, the protagonist asked the system to verify whether the information was true. After running the calculations, the system confirmed that, in fact, 2 months had passed since they entered the dungeon. Faced with that, the hero widened his eyes, realizing that there was also a time flow difference here, just like in the tutorial. The lieutenant informed them that the Prime Minister was already aware of their return and would be arriving at the location soon. Now everyone followed the lieutenant and would head to the laboratory first. As they walked, the lieutenant stopped and looked back, noticing that the hero looked sad. The protagonist couldn't believe he was once again trapped in a dimension that stole away his lifespan. After arriving at the office, they were able to watch the footage through the cameras and participated in a long meeting. After some time, the Prime Minister arrived and, relieved, saw that the three of them were well and healthy. She showed satisfaction in knowing that all had returned safely. The Lieutenant and the Prime Minister watched the recordings that Yu had made inside the dungeon. With the footage in hand, the Minister said she would thoroughly analyze the events that took place in the dungeon. Both of them watched, unable to fully believe what they were seeing, and the Prime Minister's expression turned serious. Her face conveyed a mix of agony and fury, as she would certainly take measures to put an end to that situation. First, there were other priorities, and only afterward would she contact them all. Yu was the first to stand up, visibly exhausted, wanting to return to her life as a streamer. When the Prime Minister called her, she was startled and looked in her direction, but the Prime Minister only asked that the recording remain confidential until everything had been verified, and then it would be returned. Yu no longer cared, simply closed her eyes in a satisfied gesture, and said it was no problem. After they left, only the hero, the lieutenant, and the Prime Minister remained in the room. The protagonist thought it was the right time to take it out of his pocket. The daystone he had recovered as promised. He handed it to the Prime Minister, who congratulated him, stating he had done an excellent job. She was very pleased with his performance and still didn't know the true limits of the captain's strength. She commented that he was always surpassing his own limits, though he disagreed with that. The minister knew that in situations like this, he was no different from any ordinary young man out there. Now with the daystone, humanity could be protected, and they would be one step closer to ending everything. Upon hearing her say that they were close to bringing monsters and phenomena to extinction, she could already see on his face that he was sad. Not only the Prime Minister but also the Lieutenant knew everything the young man had been through. Now he walked toward the exit of the meeting room. The Prime Minister, looking back, asked him not to forget that there were people waiting for his return. That word unsettled him, and he wondered who might be waiting for him. Upon leaving that facility, he noticed silhouettes. It was his team. But they all looked different, muscular and ragged. Worried, he asked what had happened to them to end up so worn out. The protagonist asked the system to update the information on those people. The system analyzed that all of them had undergone an awakening as players. Now they were monstrously strong. For that reason, he requested the system to thoroughly verify what had happened. The system reported that all team members now possessed a type of unknown power that didn't originally belong to them. Now every member of the group was also a power wielder, just like Kang Hui. He, watching the white-haired young man along with the other companions, could barely believe it. All of them had gone through a surprising transformation. Excited, they congratulated the captain on his triumphant return. Everyone was pleased to have the captain back, including the vice captain. Gathered, they saluted the captain, who now stood at the front. Still shaken by the changes, the protagonist merely looked in their direction. They all maintained the same formation and displayed a determined gaze. After understanding what had happened, the hero asked the team to rest. He was satisfied and commented that it seemed everyone had done a lot during his absence. As soon as Kang Hui heard the compliment, he got excited and raised his arms, shouting with enthusiasm. The captain had no idea what had really happened, but the young man kept jumping with joy. In a more serious tone, the protagonist asked the vice captain what had happened. The vice captain said many things had occurred during the captain's absence. Upon seeing their tattered clothing and the visible fatigue on each of their faces, the protagonist began to understand. But to fully grasp it, he would need to go back a bit in the story. Right after the captain entered the dungeon, a rift occurred, and another dungeon emerged in the city. The white-haired youths, along with the captain's team, were the only ones able to handle the situation. Meanwhile, the lieutenant colonel watched everything wide-eyed, as he didn't know there were others with powers. They were just as impressive as the captain himself, while the vice captain also widened his eyes. Even knowing the rookie was powerful, seeing him destroy monsters with his own eyes was different. Now he knew that, if the captain hadn't stopped the young man's punch, he would have been the one without a head. In the place where the monster had been thrown, it could have been his own body. The vice captain felt sick just seeing the creature's fallen head and how Kang had handled everything. Just imagining it made his expression turn to horror, convinced that it would have been him in the monster's place. Han Ju-won, the vice captain, was in shock at Kang Kui's strength and also relieved to have him nearby. But at the same time, he felt frustrated with his own weakness, and so he clenched his fists in anger. With a determined look, he concluded that there had to be a way to become stronger. He couldn't always depend on the captain. Now his goal was to reach the same level as that white-haired young man standing in front of him. In no time, that boy had managed to stabilize a completely chaotic situation. Everyone began thinking about approaching the rookie to seek information. The vice captain was resolute, but some recruits were afraid. Even so, he told them they couldn't depend on the captain forever. He knew he had nothing to lose by asking. If the rookie answered, great. If not, so be it. One of the soldiers was anxious, thinking the rookie might hold a grudge against the vice captain. But the vice captain assured them that it wasn't something to worry about. He said he would handle the matter himself and walked toward the boy. As he got close, he started speaking, still stammering a bit in front of the young man. Kang Kuei listened carefully to the questions, analyzing everything, as they wanted to know how to become strong. Now he stood before them, ready to explain the power he possessed. The vice captain explained that if it was possible for regular humans to acquire power, they were all willing to follow his orders. Looking at the white-haired boy, he declared that they were more than ready to obey. That made the boy smile slightly, as if an idea had formed in his mind. When he asked if everyone wanted to learn how to become stronger, the group's anticipation grew. The young man then stated that yes, it was indeed possible for everyone to reach a level similar to his. Some time later, in a rocky and isolated area, the soldiers were exhausted. They were training hard, just as promised, under the leadership of the white-haired youth. Everyone was on the brink of collapse, and the vice captain asked how much longer it would take to get there. Happily, Kang Kuei turned around and said they were almost there. After a few more steps, they stopped in front of a waterfall. Everyone was terrified and tired, but that would be the training site where they would become stronger. The vice captain wondered how such a wild place could serve as a training ground. He then asked if the young man planned to start training under the waterfall. The boy looked at the officer and said that was exactly it, curious how he had guessed. The vice captain was surprised he had guessed right, since the plan included meditation and strange herbs. Kang Kuei looked at the officer and confirmed that the training would be just like that. Now standing before the boy, everyone was a little uneasy. To set an example, the vice captain was the first to take off his jacket and begin the training. Seeing that he was taking it seriously, the others began to watch him with respect. The vice captain declared to the young man that from that moment on, he was under his command. That seemed to please the white-haired youth greatly. He stepped under the waterfall and began teaching the others how to train properly. He also demonstrated hand-to-hand combat techniques. While the others sweated, he remained calm. After that, they hung from trees to develop strength and flexibility. They climbed tall mountains, and whenever they got discouraged, the vice captain gave them motivating scoldings. They trained with ropes, carried logs and heavy stones, and did other grueling exercises. It seemed the hardest task of all was hunting a wild boar. Everyone was turning rugged. After catching the prey, they sat around a campfire and ate. Then they rested after an intense day of training, ready to start again the next day. That was when Kang Kuei began to teach some more advanced tactics. Little by little, like a sprouting and growing plant, the soldiers began to develop. The routine exercises were already becoming easier, which made the young man very satisfied. They were like sprouts that had grown enough to finally take shape. Now in the vice captain's eyes, there was not only determination, but also strength and potential. He was now able to meet the expectations of Kang Kuei and the entire team. When the training finally ended, those soldiers were completely transformed into true combat monsters. After recounting everything that had happened, the protagonist asked if that was all. The vice captain confirmed that it had happened exactly as reported. He also stated that from now on, they would be his rearguard and wanted him to trust them. Looking firmly at the group, the protagonist placed a hand on the vice captain's shoulder. Staring him in the eyes, he stated that it wasn't just from now on. He had always trusted him to guard his back. Those words brought everyone to tears, leaving the team even more excited to fight alongside their captain. As they got too close, they began hugging him, and he asked them to give him a little space. Meanwhile, the white-haired young man, watching from a distance, could see the satisfaction in that team. Alone, he began to laugh, because during the 2 months that Kim Kaibong was inside the chamber, the team members used that time to increase their strength and strengthen their bonds of solidarity and camaraderie. Far away in a dark place, a figure was analyzing technical records of certain players. They were the 3 players who had participated in the artificial dungeon. A strange person observed the files with great attention. It was someone whose face could not be seen, but who had large, piercing eyes. While that person with piercing eyes examined the documents related to the players, someone knocked at the door. She ordered whoever was outside to enter without delay. The door slowly opened, and 3 hooded figures stepped inside. In front of that imposing person, the 3 figures began to speak seriously. One of them, a bearded man, deeply regretted what had happened. He seemed to be referring to the ebony-eyed witch. Another said that the incident had not been part of the plan, but it could be corrected immediately. The person, placing a hand on the player's records, demanded that the mistake be fixed without fail. However, the thick-bearded man suggested that the leader of their trio should handle the situation himself. He seemed resolute, with his eyes locked forward and a firm stance. That was when the ebony-eyed witch declared she would go to that country. Meanwhile, in the country in question, the armed forces were searching for a safe route to transport something valuable. Communication between them was constant via radio, while the driver remained fully alert. The soldier next to him, on the other hand, kept dozing off, being constantly scolded. The driver demanded that his companions stay awake as they were transporting the corpse of the fire dragon. But the other soldier could barely stay awake that day and seemed exhausted. Whenever the driver looked away, he used the moment to sleep, and when woken up, he'd say everything was under control. Even so, the driver found it absurd to underestimate the remains of an 8-star monster, especially at a time when the country was conducting highly important research. They were traveling in an armored truck, escorted by helicopters and other military vehicles. From time to time, the helicopter pilot would contact the main driver. He asked him to stay on a straight path, as they would soon enter a tunnel and lose signal. The driver confirmed that he understood and informed that they would begin the crossing immediately. Then he looked to the side and again noticed the snores of the sleepy companion. The soldier's sleep was so deep that his head was resting against the truck's window. Though annoyed, the driver chose not to wake him again. The truck then entered the tunnel, still under watch by their ground and air escorts. Right behind, the other vehicles were preparing to enter as well. But before they could, the tunnel began to collapse, preventing the convoy from entering. Feeling the tremors and seeing the tunnel entrance blocked, the driver became fully alert. Through the rearview mirror, he noticed that none of the other trucks had entered. Outside, the soldiers panicked, not understanding what had happened. Command tried to communicate via radio and ordered the driver to make a detour quickly. The response was that only he had entered and that the rest would take an alternate route. On high alert, the driver wondered why the collapse had occurred at that exact moment. Then he pointed forward and warned his partner, because there was an identical truck stopped ahead. He slammed the brakes to avoid a collision, causing sparks to fly from the tires on the asphalt. Despite the violent braking, he managed to stop in time and avoided crashing into the stationary truck. The soldier woke up startled, not understanding where the other truck had come from. Seeing that the vehicle was identical to theirs, the driver grew suspicious. They decided to get out, armed, to investigate the mysterious truck. They abandoned the armored vehicle and cautiously approached the other one. One of them got ready to open the door while the other provided cover. Carefully, he pulled open the door of the unknown truck. Upon opening it, he found a weapon aimed directly at him. The bandits inside the truck didn't hesitate and began shooting at the 2 soldiers. They also fired at the armored truck, which withstood part of the impact due to its reinforced structure. Soon after, the criminals exited the vehicle and advanced directly toward the army's truck. The leader of the group even stepped on one of the wounded soldiers on the ground. They examined the damage done to the military truck and laughed with disdain. One of the communication devices was still functioning, and someone from command was asking how much time remained before exiting the tunnel. The leader of the ambush picked up the radio and calmly replied that 2 minutes were left. From above, the helicopter pilot relaxed as he watched the truck emerge from the tunnel. He reported that Truck 1 had exited the crossing and that everyone should proceed along the original route. With the radio in hand, the leader of the invaders remained calm and confident. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned, and they continued their journey without incident. The truck continued to be monitored by the armed forces without raising any suspicion. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the Prime Minister was attending a public lecture. Several fans were gathered in the square, attentively listening to every word of the political leader. Reporters competed for space, all captivated by the minister's charismatic presence. Gorda Costa approached and reminded her of her next appointment with the council members. She also stated that afterward, there would be a dinner with the director of the security center. As they walked, the Prime Minister listened to the updates while being photographed constantly. She was well dressed in high heels, surrounded by people and compliments from all sides. Suddenly, she felt a strange aura in the air, which made her stop. She discreetly turned to confirm her suspicion. She then noticed that the people around her seemed to be hypnotized. Even her bodyguards and secretary were eerily still. She concluded that they were all under the effect of a powerful spell. She looked around and saw herself inside a large magical circle. She recognized the energy around her as enchantment magic that required a high amount of mana. She suspected that only an extremely skilled mage could cast something like that. At that moment, someone calmly approached the minister. The person was wearing a hood and had short black hair. The Prime Minister bit her lip, for she recognized the silhouette immediately. The only one capable of such magic was the master of the Shield Guild, Park Urim. She came closer and coldly asked why the Prime Minister had done what she did. She wanted to know if the plan was truly to shut down her guild. The minister, firm, replied that the guild had committed multiple crimes. The guild master laughed upon hearing the word crimes being used against her. Angrily, she asked if she would be personally incriminated as well. The minister replied without hesitation that there was sufficient evidence to convict her. She declared that anyone who committed crimes would be punished, regardless of who they were. Showing no fear, the guild master moved closer and whispered in the minister's ear. She said the minister should try her best, because that fight was coming soon. She stated she had always wanted to face her personally. The Prime Minister then shouted the name of the Shield Guild's master. She looked at her secretary and bodyguards, knowing she couldn't fight there. If she did anything, it would put all the civilians in immediate danger. Soon, the people returned to normal, emerging from their trance-like state. One of the bodyguards asked what had just happened. The minister replied harshly and ordered the cancellation of all upcoming appointments. She instructed that the security division be summoned immediately. Meanwhile, in another region, Captain Kim K-bong and his team continued clearing dungeons. Kim K-bong and Kang Kui watched with pride at how much the group had improved. The protagonist praised the white-haired young man for the way he had resolved the last situation. Soon after, they turned around as someone urgently called out to the captain. It was a team member saying they had received orders to assemble at headquarters. Not understanding what was happening, the captain asked for the reason. The soldier replied that an unknown group had stolen the remains of the fire dragon. The news darkened the protagonist's expression. In a discreet building that raised no suspicion, the team was being assembled. In that building, there was a secret floor, and in the basement, the most important meeting of the year would take place. The Prime Minister, accompanied by her bodyguards, descended in the elevator in total silence. She presented her identification card, and once recognition was confirmed, the door opened. Inside the room, generals from the Republic's Third Army were gathered. Government officials responsible for national security and defense were also present. And of course, standing out among them all was the captain of the Special Dungeon Management Team, Kim K-bong. That meeting was a national security conference and would begin under the direct command of the Prime Minister. She looked everyone in the eye while they stood, and firmly asked them to be seated. Immediately afterward, she announced the key agenda items to be discussed that day. She began by mentioning the two most urgent current cases, the theft of the fire dragon remains, and the unexpected return of the Shield Guild's master, who had resurfaced after a long stay abroad. A video captured by airport security cameras was then shown. In it, it was clearly possible to see the group passing through the gates and blending in with the civilians. Even with distinct clothing and hoods, no one seemed to notice them or suspect their presence. Even when one of the individuals looked directly into the camera, the face appeared with disturbing clarity. At the end of the footage, the head of security confirmed the authenticity of the recorded images. He stated that the guild master's camouflage magic had intensified to an absurd degree. The minister, upon watching those scenes, expressed restrained anger and a strong sense of frustration. To her, that was a direct reflection of the failures in the national security system. As she shouted vehemently, the officer could only sweat and repeatedly offer rushed apologies. The signs of discontent on the Prime Minister's face became increasingly evident. She knew that the guild master's skills had evolved and the level of secrecy was astonishing. Even so, it was unacceptable for someone to manipulate the functioning of an entire airport. She firmly ordered that the stolen remains of the fire dragon be located urgently. One of the commanders responded cautiously, informing her that the analyses were still ongoing. Upon hearing that the operation wouldn't be easy, the minister lost her patience and slammed the table forcefully. She reminded them that the airport security cameras weren't the only ones available in the country. She stated that there were also cameras installed in patrol cars, offering more possibilities. Faced with his own negligence, the commander only lowered his head, overcome with embarrassment. The minister then placed a hand on her forehead, frustrated with the time she considered pointlessly wasted. Another leader suggested that the immediate priority should be the recovery of the dragon remains. He rightly feared that the information could leak to the public, causing an irreversible scandal. The value of that artifact was incalculable. There was no way to measure it in figures. The minister turned to Captain Kim Kibon, who watched her attentively, awaiting instructions. With a firm gaze, everyone present followed the direction of the minister's eyes. Although some admired the captain, others held expressions of disapproval toward him. The minister then declared clearly, Kim Kibon would be assigned the mission of hunting the master of the Shield Guild. Immediately, all the leaders stood up, questioning who would be in charge of the dragon case. They knew that, even being part of the government, they couldn't control that woman's decisions. She made it clear that, although Kim Kibon was brilliant, he was still only one person. And for that reason, it was necessary to divide efforts and solve both problems simultaneously. Faced with a stalemate, the others demanded to know what the strategy would be regarding the fire dragon. The minister responded firmly, revealing that the separation of missions had been intentional from the beginning. As she spoke, Kim Kibon watched her without blinking, attentive to every word she said. She said that he would hunt the guild master, while his team, along with Kang Wei, would take care of the dragon. She emphasized that both incidents had absolute priority and level 1 importance. The Minister of Security showed concern at the idea of the captain facing such a powerful player alone. But the Prime Minister, already anticipating that, stated that she had summoned someone else to assist him. In the next moment, whispers began to circulate discreetly among the officials present. Some murmured among themselves, trying to guess who the mysterious figure might be. The minister then activated the intercom and requested the immediate entry of the person in question. The door opened, and a young woman entered, with long black hair and wearing a formal suit. Her youthful appearance caused absolute silence and looks of disbelief throughout the room. One of the officials showed immediate discomfort as he recognized who she was. Her presence seemed to cause a mixture of surprise and confusion in the atmosphere. The young woman approached the central table and stopped in front of Captain Kim Kibon. As he looked her in the eyes, he heard her politely introduce herself with a slight smile. She said it was a pleasure to meet him and identified herself as Agent Gu Jua. One of the men present exploded in indignation and questioned the minister about the choice of that agent. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and said the situation required urgent measures. The officer pointed out that assigning an ordinary agent to such a risky mission was senseless. He believed she would hinder more than help Kim Kibon in the hunt. The minister listened calmly as he said it would be ideal to assign a former player as a partner. That's when another official spoke up, saying that he himself would give the necessary explanation. All eyes turned to him, and the man asked if they remembered the name Tamer. He recalled that, during the 12.10 conflict, civilians had been evacuated without a single casualty. The one responsible for the feat, he said, was the young woman known as Tamer. At the time, they discovered she was only 18 years old, and after the feat, she received national recognition. Since then, she had been appointed as an official agent of the National Intelligence Service. Now, 10 years later, she returned with her real name, Agent Gu Jua. One of the officers present recalled that he was the commanding officer at the time of the incident. He said she always disappeared before he could thank her, and now he understood why. With the atmosphere calmer, the minister gave a faint smile for the first time. She ordered that, now that there was consensus, they could begin discussing the practical plan. After the meeting ended, the white-haired young man was visibly upset. He wanted to accompany the captain but was informed that it wasn't an option. Kim explained that even against his will, he would once again rely on Kang Kui's help. Once again, the white-haired young man felt saddened and let his tears fall. When the new agent appeared, the boy had puffed cheeks, clearly sulking. She approached and calmly said she was looking for Kim Kibon. The captain tried to introduce her to Kang Wei, but the boy remained grumpy. The agent stared directly at him, which caught his immediate attention. Realizing her piercing gaze, the young man stopped sulking and stared back in fear. The woman maintained a strange expression and kept looking directly at him. The longer she stared, the wider his eyes grew in growing astonishment. He was so startled that he hid behind Kim Kibon, leaving the hero confused. Gu Jua, trying to make sense of it, said the boy's behavior was extremely improper. She coughed discreetly and commented that she hadn't expected to see the captain near a rude child. The young man protested, saying it was absurd to call him a child. Kang Wei, realizing she knew too much about him, asked in shock how she knew everything. Kim Kibon turned at him with a suspicious look. The agent, without offering any explanation, just gave a soft smile and looked peacefully at both of them. Shortly after, they left District 15 toward a place from which no one had ever escaped alive. It was a prison on the island of Celestial Evil, where prisoner 4882's cell was located. The meal tray was placed through the hatch, and the guard observed the inside. The red-haired man grabbed the lunchbox and began devouring the food with unusual ferocity. The guard noticed he was eating very well for someone convicted of serious crimes. The vice leader of the guild, indifferent to everything, continued his meal in complete silence. Outside, footsteps in the water could be heard along the dark corridor. Inside the cell, however, the red-haired man devoured every bite without concern. Hooded figures in black cloaks roamed calmly among the cells. Even when approached, they spoke little and showed no fear of the guards. Even when threatened with weapons, they neither hesitated nor retreated at the warnings. The tranquility in the air was such that the vice leader even managed to doze off for a moment. But the calm was deceptive, and soon someone identified themselves as a member of the Shield Guild. Radiating a shimmering aura, the woman proudly stated her ranking as a guild master, and declared that she had come to retrieve her dear little brother. With the actions of those intruders, the red alert was activated and the sirens blared loudly. After the soldiers warned they would shoot, they were forced to follow through. However, the leader of the Shield Guild emitted a violet-toned aura, forming a shield. Even with the soldiers firing non-stop in that direction, nothing got through the barrier. All the projectiles fell to the ground without even touching any of them. Tired of waiting, the woman walked forward and pointed her magic-charged hand at them. She glowed intensely, manipulating her magic through her hands with firm resolve. The soldiers, looking at her, knew things were about to spiral completely out of control. From afar, the entire prison system could be seen engulfed in flames. Terrified, the soldiers shouted that for her to be there, she must have passed many checkpoints. Smiling, the woman lightly said that was exactly the case. Then she released the magic concentrated at her fingertips. Several magic circles appeared beneath the feet of the trembling soldiers. She smiled, delighting in the chaos she was about to bring upon those cornered rats. After clenching her fists, she calmly asked them to get out of her way. And that's exactly what happened. Only the silhouettes remained, consumed in the flames. All were engulfed by the fire that the guild master summoned without hesitation. While the soldiers' bodies fell to the ground, that group simply moved forward. In the place where it all happened and the magical circles emerged, only destruction remained. Walking freely through the corridors, the group was searching for someone very specific. Their leader touched a cell and made it explode with a single touch. After the blast, she stood there scanning the scene, her eyes searching for something hidden. Farther ahead, a barricade had been set up by some players trying to maintain order. Faced with that leader, they were sweating but insisted they wouldn't let her advance any further. With bloodshot eyes and a devilish face, she said they should retreat if they wanted to survive. If that were the case, she might even spare their lives. Upon hearing that, one of them gave a nervous smile. But the soldiers nearby wouldn't let anything through and were already in position. They were simply waiting for an order to act and face that threat for real. One of the players mentioned that he had already anticipated that visit, which is why he had reinforced all the security. As soon as he finished speaking, several symbols appeared attempting to nullify her deception skill. It would all be useless. They thought mechanical tricks could stop that insane master. Seeing all that, she found it pathetic and began laughing like it was a comedy show. She said that now that they had finished saying all their nonsense, she could finally have fun. A player wearing a red cap and dark glasses, seeing the bluff had failed, ordered his weapon to fire. The guild master then commanded all the machines to target that player exclusively. Even with dozens of sights aimed at her, she just smiled with a completely deranged expression. Her hair began to sway from the flow of magic she was now controlling. Despite all the noise and magical pressure, the intense light didn't wake that one man. The vice leader of the Shield Guild was sound asleep, even with all the chaos around him. He seemed exhausted, resting calmly and without rush inside his cell, until a scream stood out among the others and he slowly opened his eyes. He seemed to recognize that voice, so he sat on the bed to pay more attention. When he did so, he noticed an explosive energy very close to him. Suspicious, he looked to the side and feared something was about to happen. Then someone came flying and was thrown against the wall of the cell. He noticed that person was in trouble and now looked like part of the decor. Hark Tarum watched all the dust and smoke spread through the area. Soon someone called out to him, and he looked in the other direction to see who it was. He saw some silhouettes and shadows that seemed very familiar to him. He fixed his eyes on the young woman with a sweet and friendly smile and realized it was his sister. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the plane flew over the region near the prison. As soon as it landed, the protagonist and the agent assigned to work alongside him got off. They observed one of the sectors that the woman and her allies had completely destroyed. It was clear that the entire complex was now nothing but ashes and ruins. Even though she had wide eyes and was sweating, the young woman had expected this. But seeing the scene in person was completely different from merely imagining it. She thought they should first search for survivors and said so while looking at the bodyguard. Amid all the confusion, the helicopter landed while several guards watched everything closely. And when he received the news that there were no survivors in the complex, he he closed his eyes. After showing a saddened expression, he looked at the young woman and confirmed that no one was alive inside. She was shocked by that, but he assured her he would explain everything in detail later. The young woman agreed but thought that man was always too hasty. He started walking, and she quickened her pace to catch up before losing sight of him. And when they entered the complex, the expression in their eyes grew even heavier. Even the protagonist, who had seen countless horrific scenes, was shocked by the soldiers' bodies. The scene was hard to digest. Everyone was lying on the floor in random positions. Some had only had time to lean against the wall and sit down before collapsing. Those people claimed the magical formation had worked, yet they had still been defeated. The protagonist told her that no force could withstand the pressure of a greater force. With a saddened look and head bowed, she said they had always been one step behind the criminals. Looking at her, the hero asked where they should go next. He said he had a way to find out, and saying that, opened his palm. From it began to radiate an intense light, and soon after, he planted it into the ground. That bundle of glowing energy attracted several rodents that ran over to the spot. They seemed to be responding to a call, and when they arrived, she crouched and spoke to them. Duello looked at the protagonist, whose eyes were wide open, and asked him not to be so startled. She explained that the little mice were her friends, just like all the other tiny animals. Tamer was a player with the ability to work with plants and critters as if they were allies. Even among players, it was an extremely rare class. She could communicate with the little rodents. She thought that despite everything, it was impossible to hide everything. Someone would always end up seeing. On that occasion, it was the little rats who saw everything and brought her information. While she was doing that, the protagonist gave mental orders to the system to investigate that girl. The system reported that she communicated with animals and that it was one of her abilities. The woman said that, according to the rats, after a terrifying maneuver, the enemies escaped from the prison. They told her that their formation headed west, and she said she would begin the pursuit from there. She also mentioned that no matter how good the guild master was at deception, it wasn't possible to fool everyone. Meanwhile, a few hooded, rough-looking individuals seemed to be watching over an old shed. Inside, someone was dressing properly, and that was the vice leader of the Shield Guild. He asked his sister how she managed to get into such a well-protected prison. He also said that the Prime Minister wouldn't just stand by and watch that happen. When he said that, he was scolded by his sister, who looked at him with a sinister expression. He was so afraid of her that he started sweating just from seeing that deadly stare. With a terrifying look, she told him to never utter that woman's name again. To the guild leader, that woman was nothing more than an ungrateful cow who hadn't even thanked them for their help. After being scolded, the brother thought she had always hated the Prime Minister with all her strength. The older sister smiled upon seeing that he had properly listened to her lecture. Worried, he asked what they would do next and suggested fleeing abroad, or maybe rebuilding the Shield Guild and trying for a new chance somewhere else. She just laughed at everything, as if she were hearing a joke. Park Taram was horrified when she said he would soon learn the answer. Moving with determination, she said there was still something she needed to finish. That country, for which they had risked so much for so long, had been ungrateful and treacherous. Not just the country, but also that woman who had made it her mission to hunt down everyone in their guild. Now the guild leader was considering starting a hunt against the Prime Minister and her allies. Her younger brother thought it was far too risky to go against an entire country and was already shaking in fear. Just imagining he would have to face the protagonist again left him paralyzed. His sister placed her hand on his shoulder and said he had grown cowardly during their time apart. He insisted that she should flee abroad because he believed they would lose this war. Those words deeply irritated the woman, and he realized he should stop talking. Her energy flow had always been strong, but now it seemed more intense and furious. She grabbed both his arms tightly and asked him to listen carefully. She would no longer act as before because she was no longer the same person. As she said this, her eyes were full of hatred, and veins bulged on her forehead. With an infernal glare, she said that no one would ever be able to stop her reach again. Park Taram, eyes frozen, listened as his sister said that anyone who tried would fail. With that, the scene shifts back to the protagonist and the agent working alongside him.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.